Hello, welcome to Modern Day Debates. My name is Carissa, and I'm going to be your host for tonight. Today we are going to be talking about right versus left libertarianism. I'm really excited. We have a really awesome lineup tonight. So the purpose of Modern Day Debate is to give everyone a fair and equal chance to be able to give their perspectives on things and to be able to have that perspective also attacked in a respectful manner. So if you really like debates, we are a debating channel that covers politics and religion and science. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There's going to be a lot of debates coming up. So the format of today's debate is going to be a little different than normal. Unfortunately, our one debater, Dr. Heumer, was not able to make it tonight. So Dr. Friedman is going to have a 20-minute opening. Brenton, Lengel, and NonCompete are both going to do 10-minute openings. We're going to start with NonCompete. So then we're going to go into an hour of discussion, open discussion, followed up by 30 minutes of question and answer. So if you do have any questions, just fire it into the super chat, and we will definitely get to those. Make sure that you are attacking people's ideas, not the actual people themselves. That's a really important distinction. After that, then you also can check out the links of the speakers in the description box below. We have, again, some really amazing people, and they have even more content that you're able to check out, so definitely do that. So if we can go ahead and get started in the introductions. Dr. Friedman, he is a professor of law, and he's an author, an economist. Dr. Friedman, what would people expect to find at your link?
What do people expect
to find at your link in the description?
I see. Well, I have a website, and the website has the full text of a fair number of my books. This is it, daviddfriedman.com. It also has a link to my blog, which has been running for about 15 years, and so has quite a lot of comments on a wide variety of different things. I'm a retired law professor, an economist. I have never taken a course for credit in either of those two fields, although I've taught at quite a lot of schools at the undergraduate and graduate level. My doctorate's actually in physics, but I switched fields early on. I have a bunch of other interests. I write poetry. I and my wife and daughter research medieval cooking for the fun of it. A variety of other things. And you can, if you go to my website, you can find, among other things, links to a few hundred medieval recipes, to some of my poetry, and to lots and lots of my books, which include 3 novels and, I don't know, about 6 or 7 nonfiction books having something to do with economics and law. The book that's most relevant to what we're discussing this time is my book, The Machinery of Freedom, which was published almost 50 years ago, amazingly enough. The 3rd edition came out a few years ago, and in that I try to sketch out what a society without a government but with private property and trade, what we sometimes call an anarcho-capitalist society, might look like, and why I think it would give a desirable results. So I guess that's enough of an introduction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Brenton, you have been on this channel multiple times before. You're a comic writer, a playwright, and you also occupied Wall Street at one point.
Yep, got thrown into a motorcycle by a cop.
Oh no, oh my goodness. But what would the chat expect to find at your link if they clicked it?
Sure. I mean, if they click on my link, you're going to find my YouTube channel. I just started it. It's been growing very fast. We just broke 1,000 subscribers. The main thing that I'm famous for at this point is my comic, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which was just nominated for 2 Ringo Awards. And the second issue is coming out. I just got the proofs back for the additional mini comic that's being published with it. And we're about to run a Kickstarter to fund the 3rd, 4th, and get the whole series out there. So that's really exciting. I've also collaborated with the goth electro pop band The Crew Shadows. We're working on a novel together, which is really exciting. It's a fantasy novel set in the afterlife, and I have had 7 plays produced in New York City, ranging in topics from the Appalachian Trail, which I hiked in its entirety, to the New York City open mic scene, to Vikings, like Vikings in Iceland in the year 900. So that's what people will find. If you go to my channel, you're going to find me talking about politics, philosophy, and Buddhism.
Oh wow, it's quite a wide variety of things. That's awesome. All right, NonCompete, you are a YouTuber, pretty big channel. What would people expect to find at your link?
Well, first, I guess I want to say all of us so far are kind of in the same nerdy wheelhouse. I think I used to do medieval reenactment when I was in high school.
Ditto.
I would love to write a fantasy novel. I've been trying for like decades, but I've never actually finished one. So I think we have a lot of the same nerdy hobbies, or whatever you want to call it. But no, as far as my channel and my link are concerned, NonCompete is a channel that I do with my partner, who's actually a Vietnamese Marxist-Leninist. Although we actually have influenced each other a lot. She, for instance, would agree with me that anarchism is the best form and mode of revolution in the United States of America to get rid of capitalism based on the material conditions of the USA. And I live here in Vietnam, so I actually see a lot of really good aspects of this society, which, believe it or not, I believe are fully compatible with anarchism and actually prove some of the points of anarchism, like the proof in the pudding kind of thing, because which we can probably get into that in debate. But anyway, my channel is focused on obviously anarchist philosophy, politics. We do live streams, and I have a series of anarcho-communist puppet shows. If you're into that, most people are not, based on the viewership, but that's available.
Like
but
a radical Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, we try. I do have a video on Mr. Rogers, actually. But yeah, that's that. I try to cover, mostly I talk about the more serious stuff lately, but we do have fun and talk about pop culture and stuff. But it's been a bit tense and serious lately, so it's gotten a little bit more serious. But we still try to have some levity from time to time.
All right.
While talking about this important stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, another thing that I do want to mention is that today is actually a charity stream. So all of the revenue from Super Chats are all going to the charity Save the Children. It has been checked out, and just to make sure that it is a transparent organization. And if you would like a receipt of that, just email moderndaydebate@gmail.com, and James would be happy to provide that to you. So without further ado, we can get into the opening statements. NonCompete, if you want to go ahead and start with your 10-minute opening, we can get rolling.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I want to say, just very briefly, if you're not familiar with anarcho-communism or anarchism, the basic idea is that we are opposed to hierarchies as a rule, certainly what we call unjust hierarchies, and we believe that any hierarchy that would exist in society has to prove its own merit to the people who are participating in the hierarchy. We are completely against coercion. We believe that consent is key for working for human beings to work with each other, and we believe that the governing principles of functional society should be mutual aid, which means that we help each other without any expectation of anything in return, and we believe that will lead to the a productive and happy society that would be free of those kinds of hierarchies and coercion. I believe that if you're more familiar, as most Americans I believe probably are, with the right anarcho-capitalist sort of version of libertarianism, you probably are familiar with the the disagreement that states should exist, which actually we agree with. That's something where we agree between the right and the left versions of anarchism, or the capitalist and socialist versions of libertarianism. We agree that the state is inherently unjust. We believe that the state should not exist. Something that I like to say a lot early on in these discussions is that as an anarcho-communist, I don't believe in a state. And the way I define a state is a system of government that puts one class of people in a hierarchical position of authority above other classes of people. That's to me the most important distinction between a state and any other form of organization or government, or call it what you will. So what I believe in is self-government, which is to say we as people can lead ourselves. We can do this through democratic means, but the design of the democratic system is very, very important. So obviously you can design a system that has all of the phenomena of a democracy and all of the appearance of a democracy, but it's not truly democratic. And I would say that the United States of America is a perfect example of that, since there are so many mechanisms that stand between the people and governance, whether you're talking about the Electoral College, redlining, bureaucracy, all of these different mechanisms. And of course, that's not even to mention the incredibly brutal, dominating, coercive force of the police, which is an institution that actually didn't form from the state initially. Initially, the police formed from slave owners, private individuals who hired slave patrols to go out and catch slaves. And not only that, but then there were the Indian patrols in the colonial era. Those were formed, to basically subjugate Native Americans, indigenous people. And then there were private police forces in the 19th and early 20th century, including the Pinkertons and many others, that existed simply to subjugate workers who had unionized and collectivized and began to resist capitalism. The capitalists were able to institute private police forces that worked hand in glove with the state police force to suppress workers. So I guess what's very important for me to distinguish between the socialist version of libertarianism and the right-wing version of libertarianism is that we see any form of coercion or dominance or unjust hierarchy as, unacceptable. So we're not only skeptical of the state, and I know that right-wing libertarians are also skeptical of corporations, and they believe in, I'm not going to assume what Dr. Friedman would say about this, but I know that I've talked to many of my right-wing libertarian, I'm a former right-wing libertarian myself. I should have mentioned that. I'm a former capitalist. I guess I'll get into that real quick. I ran several businesses. I've had dozens of employees and subcontractors and that sort of thing. I know exactly how I exploited the workers that I had. I know exactly the mechanisms that I used to steal labor value from them, which I see as a coercive and deceptive institution. I don't believe that it's possible for somebody to exist as a worker under capitalism in a truly voluntary basis. I believe that there is a inherent coercion to it when you have a system where millions, and we see it especially with COVID-19 recently, where you have millions of people who don't want to work at Taco Bell and Hobby Lobby and Burger King or whatever, without proper personal protective equipment, without proper health care and assurances that they will be treated if they get COVID, without paid sick leave. They don't want to work. We've had well over 500 strikes since COVID-19 broke out with these kinds of workers. And yet they're still out there working because, again, on the other hand, if they stop working, they are put into a situation where before the pandemic, 1 in 7 people in the USA relied on food banks. More than 50% of people in some states and around 50% of people in most states are currently facing eviction. So if your choices are between work for Taco Bell without personal protective equipment and without proper health care and those kinds of guarantees, or starve and become evicted during a pandemic, I just see that as inherently coercive. Now, that brings me back to what I was going to say about the whole, this libertarian notion of, the problems aren't with capitalism, they're with corporatism. And I just want to go ahead and say, I cannot envision a system of capitalism existing where individual capitalists are allowed to own the means of production, the factories, the businesses, the heavy machinery and equipment, all the things that are needed. And nowadays, I guess you could also say things like servers, all the things that are necessary to build a functional business. If one individual owns those means of production, I don't know how you have that kind of system without corporatism eventually, or probably pretty quickly on, stemming from that capitalistic arrangement. Certainly in the 19th century, during the Gilded Age, when we had much less regulation, I mean, right-wing libertarians like to think of the Victorian England as this golden era when there was like no regulation and people could just run their businesses as they chose. That's when we saw, again, brutal, dominating, violent coercion of workers. That's why communism initially evolved, was to push back against that violent oppression. It wasn't really such a golden era for the workers, and certainly we saw that without state intervention and with capitalist domination, we had a very brutal, dominant, coercive system in place, and that still exists in many places. In South America and Asia today, where we have capitalist entities that have, overwhelming authority. It even exists here in Vietnam, which is obviously a very complicated country. There is capitalism here, just as there is a powerful state here. So I see a lot of these problems firsthand in terms of, the strikes that occur in Vietnam, and there are there were about 130 strikes in Vietnam last year, I believe, and most of those were against imperialist companies from Korea, Japan, Europe. Where these companies are coming in and they have massive amounts of power and wealth, and of course they're using that to imperialistically dominate other countries. So then we have to think about the international coercion that's taking place. There are a lot of coercive forces beyond simply the state. And in my mind, the reason that I went from being a right-wing anarcho-capitalist to being a left-wing anarcho-communist is because I realized that a corporation can have just as much, if not more power, and an individual billionaire can have just as much, if not more power than the state, especially now in this era where we have private contractors with massive private armies, which really just goes back to, it to me echoes the feudal era when we had individual lords who had their own little private armies. And if there was conflict within society, these armies would fight with each other. So I basically am strictly opposed to any form of coercion. I see the state as a coercive force, but I see the state and capitalism as more really a dynamic system where they reinforce each other. The capitalists reinforce the state through things like lobbying, through things like investing in political candidates and then essentially owning them. Once a person gets elected, by the way, in the United States of America as a politician, and I know this because I used to do marketing for political candidates. I used to do political communications work. The first day they start raising funds for their next election campaign, and that's what they're kind of involved with primarily for the rest of their term in office. So capitalists reinforce the state and control the state in many ways, and the state in exchange reinforces the capitalists. And I just don't see any way of undermining that as long as private individuals are allowed to own the means of production. I think that collectivism and democracy are the solutions to these coercive forces. And so that's basically, I think, in a nutshell, what I believe in and the way I distinguish myself from a right-wing libertarian. Although we agree on a lot of things. I've seen lectures that Dr. Friedman has put on, and I would say we agree with at least 50% of the things that we both believe are very important in terms of designing society. So I think you'll see a lot of overlap, but I did want to distinguish early on some of the differences that I have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, Brenton, if you want to go ahead and give your opening.
Sure. And before I begin, I just want to say I want to really applaud Dr. Friedman. I've been going over his lectures to prepare for this as well. And I agree with a lot of what I hear. I think he's probably one of the smartest and most cogent voices coming from right libertarianism. And anybody who knows me knows I've been arguing with these people since like 2014. So it is a privilege to speak with him here. And he's being a very good sport, especially not having the handicap of not having a partner at this point. So I just want to hats off to you, sir. So we are here tonight because of one of the most fundamental ideas and ideals in Western culture, freedom. Nearly everyone in the West, with the exception of a few fascists and unfortunately an increasing number of conservative politicians, agree that freedom and liberty are good things. And that right there is the common point of agreement between myself, my partner, and our esteemed interlocutor. I think that it is fair to say that all of us agree that the goal of society should be to guarantee the greatest amount of liberty for the greatest number of people. But should is a dangerous word, and freedom itself is a slippery concept. It's all very easy to say the freedom to swing your fist ends at my nose, but in a world of exponentially increasing complexity, where we are faced with a plethora of moral and economic dilemmas that human law and even normative human morality are simply not equipped to handle in their entirety. And that's when we constrain ourselves purely to the realm of the hypothetical. Once you work in problems of implementing freedom as policy and the machinations of bad actors who seek not freedom but license to dominate and abuse, to gain at the expense of their fellow humans and the planet as a whole, our relation to this seemingly simple ideal becomes all the more obscured and fraught. Enter political libertarianism, named as such by French anarcho-communist poet, philosopher, and writer Joseph de Jacques, who coined the term in 1857. The tree of libertarianism, in its proper historical context, grew out of the more radical currents of the French Revolution and built on the still unfulfilled promise of liberalism. Anarchism sought, and indeed still seeks, to guarantee liberty, equality, and fraternity for all of mankind. For as noted by left libertarian Mikhail Bakunin, famously, liberty without socialism is privilege and injustice, and socialism without liberty is slavery and brutality. Now, Americans in particular may have a hard time understanding this because our current conception of socialism rests in the legacy of Cold War era propaganda put out by the US government. From the mouths of every mindless flag-waving politician, capitalism is based upon private property and individual enterprise, and socialism is based upon totalitarian government control and forced collective action. This simplistic lie was forced down my throat by parents, educators, government-approved textbooks, time and time again, just as the specter of the Soviet Union and Red China was trotted out over and over again to make sure that we continue to buy into America's most popular and widespread religion, that of capitalism, the free market, and the invisible hand. In short, as a red-blooded American male, I was raised to love capitalism, and I was taught from a very early age that capitalism was synonymous with freedom and socialism with a kind of Stalinistic slavery and enforced conformity. And so naturally, once I became disillusioned with the young Republican conservatism of my youth, largely over the GOP's overt homophobia and the disaster that was the global war on terror, I naturally gravitated towards the positions that Dr. Friedman currently espouses. I embraced right libertarianism, and this seemed logical and reasonable to me. That is, until I got out of college and actually got a job. One of the blind spots of popular American ideology as a country born of revolution that prides itself on entrepreneurship, individualism, and anti-authoritarianism is the fact that our actual liberty is not really under threat from our government. Unless, of course, we are part of a minority community. The fact is that the greatest imposition on our freedom comes from our jobs. In short, we all need money to live. And if we do not obtain this money, we will very quickly find ourselves denied food, shelter, and crucial medical care, and we will be within the crosshairs of law enforcement. The only way to obtain this money is either to be born independently wealthy or to agree to sublimate our will and spend the majority of our infinitely valuable time on this planet between cradle and grave under the direction of an employer. Now, you might say you can work for yourself, and yes, some of us can, but not all of us, and not even the majority. A neo-Jeffersonian society dominated by independent contractors is economically unfeasible and impossible, and so this is not a solution. Similarly, my interlocutor might say, you're free to get another job, one more to your liking. But he damn well knows that isn't really a solution either, because a statist could just as easily say, if you think taxation is theft, you're free to go somewhere else. Love it or leave it is not a solution. There is nowhere else to go. And that there is where we come back to the traditional libertarian philosophy, which is to say classical anarchism, the philosophy of Peter Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Mikhail Bakunin. Ultimately, what left libertarianism is a critique of power. And what is power? It is the ability to increase or decrease a person's available options at your discretion. Left libertarians do not like power. Why? Because power by its very nature is coercive. And let me say that again. Power by its very nature is coercive. Power and tyranny go hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin. This is why we have the phrase power corrupts. And I'm sure Dr. Friedman would agree with me when we talk about political power. But what he does not seem to realize or refuses to acknowledge is that wealth is also power. Or if he does, he'll claim that wealth is justified power. Why? Because the powerful person in question has proved their worth in the free market and is ultimately answerable to that same free market. Just as I'm sure many feudal lords claimed that the king had proved his worth via his bloodline and was ultimately answerable to the will of God. Because, of course, as I have said, capitalism is the most popular religion in the Western world. So what's the alternative? How do we square this circle? How do we reconcile the fact that markets are inherently biased towards previous actors within those markets, and that success tends to have a snowballing effect? How do we get around the fact that the psychology and skills associated with success within a marketplace are not necessarily correlated with the psychology and success that make a good leader, and that the businessman rarely, if ever, knows how to create good, solid social policy? Well, luckily, we can look to history for our answer. The great suppressed history of the left libertarians, the philosophy that led to farmers and factory workers with homemade bombs and antique rifles decisively defeating a modern mechanized army for the first time in recorded history. We can look at the model that collectivized the entire Argonne Front and governed the entire city of Barcelona successfully for 3 years, leading to a massive production boom. A situation that world-renowned author and journalist George Orwell personally witnessed and described as, quote, something I recognized immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. We can look to the recovered factories movement in Argentina, where after a few years of hyper-capitalism that ravaged the country's hundreds of workers seized their shuttered factories, which were currently being stripped for parts and sold off by their owners, and ran them democratically with no bosses so that their friends, family, and loved ones would have food in their bellies and a roof over their heads. We can look at the Zapatistas in Chiapas and to the PKK-YPG in Rojava, who successfully defended their families from the threat of ISIS while carrying out a previously unthinkable progressive socialist revolution in the Middle East. What we can't do is look at anarcho-capitalist societies, because these societies do not exist. And every attempt to create them has either imploded hilariously, like the Republic of Minerva, or been an outright scam to steal the money from well-meaning, principled right libertarians like Galt's Gulch, Chile. The times in history when private property and the free market were in total command of a society have been monstrous human rights failures. For instance, the Congo Free State, in which 20 million Congolese were murdered by Leopold II of Belgium, a crime rivaling the Holocaust and the worst Stalinist purges, and all of this was to gain a sum of rubber and minerals with no other guiding ideology but the law of profit and loss. Ultimately, the great fallacy of right libertarianism is that it does not address, critique, and check all forms of power. Rather, it forbids one form of power, that of the nation state, in favor of another form of power, that of the property owner. Right libertarians, as intelligent and well-meaning as they may be, are not solving this problem. They're just passing the buck. So how does left libertarianism solve this problem? Well, if we think about power as a vacuum that must be plugged, and I'm sure everyone who remembers the disaster that was Iraq post-invasion knows this is a very good way to think about power, we can see that humans have traditionally plugged this power vacuum with several large boulders, those of kings, presidents, and if Dr. Friedman has his way, CEOs and billionaires. The left libertarians instead propose that we grind those boulders to pebbles or sand and plug the vacuum that way. If we have a society in which everyone's positive and negative liberty is more or less equal, a society that prevents privileged bullies from rising up and dominating, we will check each other. We will, in fact, all become our brother's keeper and fulfill the long-denied promise of liberalism, that of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that is why I state unequivocally that the true path to liberty, equality, and fraternity, the true path to maximizing our positive and negative freedoms, can be found within the classical anarchist left libertarian tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenton. All right, Dr. Friedman, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that Emerican agrees with some of what I have written and said. If people agreed with everything I said, who could I argue with? It would be a very boring world. I don't think the terms right and left are really very useful. I think it a little odd to say that I'm so far right that I'm in favor of open borders and drug legalization. And I would like to describe the system I'm defending, which is, I think, the system that my opponents are critiquing, as proprietarian anarchy. That is, as a system where you do not have a government and where individuals coordinate by voluntary interaction within institutions of private property and exchange. And that includes the possibility of large firms, small firms, of individual people who self-publish, a great number of different possible ways it can happen. The fundamental problem that all societies face is what economists call the coordination problem, that the world is full of people with different abilities and different objectives. And for anybody to achieve his objectives pretty nearly, he requires coordination with a very large number of other people, thousands, maybe millions. The sort of standard example that people like to give is making a pencil. If you think about it, making a pencil requires wood, requires chainsaws, requires steel, requires gasoline, requires copper, requires coal, requires iron ore. Once you think through all of the people who have contributed to making a pencil, you're probably talking of something over 1 million people. And the problem is, how do you coordinate those people? How do you arrange that if what I want to achieve requires 5 minutes of your time, you possibly being somebody on the other side of the world who I've never met, you both know that I value what you could do for me, and you have a reason to do it. That's the problem. I usually say that there are 2 solutions to this problem, and the obvious one doesn't work. The obvious solution is top-down control. You have somebody who figures out what everybody should do, tells them to do it. That's a workable solution for very small groups. If you're thinking about a small firm run by its owner, or a football team, or a group of people who are campaigning for a political candidate who they all favor, that kind of system works there, but it doesn't scale. The system that scales is decentralized coordination using institutions of property and exchange. That I get you to contribute to my objectives by contributing to yours. If there were only 3 of us, I could just do it by saying, look, I'll do this for you if you do that for me. But when there are 10 million of us, that really doesn't work, because I want a tiny, tiny bit of what you're doing. And the way we solve that problem is to have transactions on an anonymous market. We have private property and some form of money and trade. The fact that I need something means I go out on the market and try to buy it. My trying to buy it means other people have an incentive to produce it. And that's a system we observe working around us every day. That if you think about the world you're living in for a couple of minutes, you should conclude we're all dead. Because after all, in order for us to live, in order for us to get the food we routinely eat, people 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 miles from us have to be producing food and fertilizer and tractors and a bunch of other things. And there's nobody in charge. And it nonetheless works through the market system. And a full explanation of how that works and why it comes close to giving us the right answer, though not a perfectly right answer, takes a semester or 2 of price theory. If you want to teach yourself, I've got a book called Hidden Order, which is an attempt to do that in a book you read for the fun of it rather than because it's assigned, because I think that's a better way of learning things. Since the people I'm arguing with are left anarchists, I really ought to mention a third way of coordination. And that's the kind of voluntary cooperation that you get in a well-functioning family, that you get in a team of volunteers for some project they're all in favor of. That happens routinely within a capitalist system. There's nothing in capitalism that prevents that. But it has the same problem as top-down coordination, that it doesn't scale. That there may well be a dozen people who share my objective. There are not 10 million people who share my objectives. There might be a dozen people who love me and therefore are willing to do things just because they want me to be well off. There are not 10 million. I like to say that there are really 3 ways in which one person can get somebody else to do the things he wants done. And those 3 ways are love, trade, and force. Love works on a very small scale, and I really should include, along with love, having common objectives. You occasionally get that working on a scale of hundreds of people. If you think of something like the Oneida Commune in the 19th century, where the people are essentially sharing a common religion, ideology, but it's very hard to scale it beyond that. So if you don't allow for trade, and trade requires property, I've got to own something to be able to sell it to you, then the real alternative is force, and that's the one we generally get. So my challenge to the left anarchists is, without property, how do you solve the coordination problem? Without a system where people produce things, own them, and can exchange them with other people, how do you arrange that the very large number of people who have to coordinate in order for anybody to achieve pretty nearly anything, with rare exceptions, can somehow do it? And your requirement is both that all of those people know what you want, know what they have to do to make their tiny contribution to your projects, and they have an incentive to do it. Because, of course, each person has his own objectives. Very few of them share my particular objectives, so they have to have some other reason to do it, which, of course, a price and the fact that they can get paid for it gives them. All right, let me go on to say a little bit more about this. Markets and property are already used to coordinate on a global scale. That most of the things, many of the things we consume are made ultimately by people all over the world. They have been spectacularly successful. It's easy to complain about things that you have no standard of comparison if all you're saying is, well, look, I could imagine it being better. But we have some data. The developed countries of the world at the moment, the average real income is about 20 to 30 times what the global average was through most of history. We have a rather striking, more recent case, and that's China. That China, under Mao, tried to coordinate without a private property and trade system. They lurched sort of between failed decentralization via communes and failed centralization. Mao died. The Chinese leadership, which consisted, as far as I can tell, of intelligent people who, in fact, wanted to do good, finally got the opportunity to go outside of China. And what did they discover? They discovered that their country, with what they believed was the world's best economic system, was dirt poor, was one of the poorest countries in the world. A top-level Chinese bureaucrat went to England, and he reported back that a trash collector in London had a substantially higher real income than he did, and that England would be the perfect communist society if only it had a communist party running it. China abandoned that. China is not nearly as capitalist as I would like it to be at this point. It's got lots of things wrong with it, but compared to what it was before Mao died, it is a relatively capitalist system. From Mao's death to the year 2000, I don't have more recent data, the real per capita income of China went up about 20-fold. That's just an enormous increase in human welfare that came from a partial shift to a capitalist system. The problem which most people, I think saying that, well, I shouldn't be responding to things you said, but I would say that most people in the US and the developed world have a very mixed view of capitalism, that they are not, most of them, in favor of socialism, though some of them are, but they assume that there are important things that can't be done by capitalist institutions and therefore has to be done by the government. And I prefer to focus on the ones for which that argument seems strongest, the sort of core activities of government, which are basically law and law enforcement. And the anarcho-capitalist solution to that problem is that you have private firms which sell their customers the service of protecting their rights and settling their disputes. The problem that everybody comes up with when they hear that, I'm thinking especially of Ayn Rand, but it's true of lots of other people, is what happens when I think you've stolen my television set and you deny it, and we have different rights enforcement agencies. Don't they end up fighting each other? And the answer is that warfare is a very expensive procedure for settling disputes, expensive enough that it's almost only used by governments. That the sensible thing for those agencies to do, recognizing this problem is going to keep occurring, is to agree in advance on a private court, a private arbitration agency, and agree that when my client loses the case, my agency won't try to prevent him from paying damages or whatever the verdict is, and similarly when your client loses the case. What enforces this? The obvious question is, since in my system there's no government to enforce contracts, and what enforces it is the discipline of constant dealings. The fact that these are repeat players, and each agency knows that if it reneges on the agreement today, tomorrow when the case goes the other way, the other one will renege on it, and then they will end up having to pay hazard pay to their employees because they're shooting at each other, and that means they're going to go out of business because they will be competing with other rights enforcement agencies that behave in a more civilized manner. So what creates the law? And in this, I should say, not all libertarian anarchists agree. I would say that my most important disagreement with Murray Rothbard, who's a prominent person who started being a libertarian anarchist even earlier than I did, is that he thinks that philosophers will solve the problem, that essentially everybody will agree on what is just. I don't think that's very likely to happen in the real world. But what will happen in my system is that the arbitration agencies, the private courts, want to produce legal rules and legal procedures that their customers, which are the rights enforcement agencies, like, so they can sell their services to them. The rights enforcement agencies want to produce legal rules and laws and law enforcement mechanisms that their customers want to be under, so that the customers won't go off to another seller of the same service. So therefore, it's in the interest of the arbitration agencies to try to craft legal rules that are the rules that are in the interest of the population that those services are being sold to. That's the basic argument. I go through it in much more detail in Machinery of Freedom, and since I'm an economist, I put it in terms of economic efficiency. That does not prove it'll be libertarian. I can imagine circumstances, I've long said, where given the views that the customers have, some rules that I disapprove of might end up being enforced. Unfortunately, I don't know of any set of institutions that prevents that, since I can't control the people in a system once I imaginally set it up. But on the whole, liberty works. I think that's one of the things that libertarians tend to agree on. And if on the whole liberty works, then legal rules that are the ones people want to live under will tend to be rules that enhance liberty, that it is uncommon for it to be worth more to you to oppress me than it is to me not to be oppressed. Now, I should say there may be things that governments do better than the private market. Unlike a lot of libertarians, I don't claim that that's impossible. There are a set of economic problems that go under the label of market failure. However, if you think about where market failure comes from, it comes from situations where people are taking an action where either most of the cost or most of the benefit goes to someone else. That's possible in some circumstances on the market system, but it's unusual, it's an exception. That's the normal situation in a political system, that whether you're voting or passing laws or lobbying, almost all of the costs and benefits of your action goes to other people. So it is very often in the political interest of people to pass laws that in fact make the population worse off rather than better off. And the individual voters are not in a position to compare the alternatives because they only get to see one of them at a time. Whereas in my system, you get at least some comparative information on how good a job one rights enforcement agency or another is doing. It's still not perfect. Furthermore, the individual voter has no incentive to be well informed because he knows that the chance of his vote changing the outcome of an election in a society of many millions of people is very close to zero. Whereas in a market situation, whether you're buying cars or buying law, you know that your choice to some significant degree determines what happens to you, and therefore you have an incentive to try to do a rational job of being informed. Now, there are problems with this system, and since I've got more time than I originally expected to, I should say there are a set of potential problems. One of them is national defense, and it's not clear how under either my system or your system we defend against foreign countries that might want to conquer us. There are circumstances in which we might be able to, but that's going to depend a whole lot on the culture of the society, how powerful and aggressive our neighbors are, and things of that sort. A further problem is that if you end up with only a small number of rights enforcement agencies, they might decide that robbery is more profitable than business. They might, in effect, cartelize and reinvent government. So therefore, the system is likely to be stable if in equilibrium the rights enforcement agencies are small enough so there are quite a lot of them, unstable if they're large enough so there are only 2 or 3 or 4. There are a variety of other things which I think of as market failure on the market for law. which explain why under some circumstances my argument won't hold, and I discuss this in some detail in the third edition of Machinery of Freedom. I should say the second edition you can read for free. It's a PDF on my webpage. The third edition is, I think, either $3 or $5 as a Kindle from Amazon if people want it. Let me say a little bit at the end on the possibility of anarcho-capitalism in cyberspace. I don't think it's likely that what I'm describing is going to happen within my lifetime, unless they solve the aging problem, which I hope they will, in real space. On the other hand, if you think of interactions in cyberspace, especially if you're familiar with how public key encryption works, there is the possibility for a world with a very high level of privacy, a world which has more privacy than humans have ever known. You can use digital cash for making payments. You can use digital signatures to prove that you're the same person that I did business with yesterday, and therefore I know whether to trust you from past behavior. And you can find a fairly detailed discussion of this either in my book, Future Imperfect, which deals with a whole bunch of future technological changes that might happen and might revolutionize the world, or in an article on my webpage called, I think, A World of Strong Privacy. And there are going to be good and bad things about that. One interesting possibility is that if we end up with a world where most of what people do is in cyberspace, which I think is at least possible via virtual reality and such, we then also have a world where individuals are very mobile. And the more mobile individuals are, the less power states have. Because a state, if the cost to me of moving from one country to another is low, then the government becomes something more like a landlord than a government, and is competing with all the other landlords out there. Let me see, what else do I want to say? I've already put up where my webpage is. I think I've got about 2 minutes from what I've seen before, and I don't want to start responding to things that you have said. But the basic argument I'm making is that a system of private property and trade makes possible decentralized coordination. It makes it possible what I think of as a desirable way. Go back to the question of what liberty means. Everybody likes the idea of each person controlling his own life. And the problem is, how is that possible in an interdependent society? All right, if you imagine each person is out in the woods homesteading all by himself, he could make all the decisions for himself. But given that my food has to be produced by somebody else, given a whole bunch of things of that sort, how can I still be free? And I think the answer is that private property is what I think of as the machinery of freedom. That is the mechanism such that I get your cooperation by offering you benefits that are large enough so that you would rather sell to me than to somebody else. I observe the costs of my action and what I have to pay people to do what I want, to get what I want. Thus, you end up with, I think, the possibility in a private property society of a world where each person controls his own action. Now, there are always limits to that. I don't get to control my own action to the extent of having the woman I want to marry me. She gets to decide too. I don't get to have other people provide me food without my doing anything for them. But I do get to have other people provide me food if I'm willing to give them in exchange something that they value. And the market gives a very, very sophisticated way of doing that on a very small, dispersed, decentralized scale. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. So now we'll go into our hour segment of open discussion.
Right.
Awesome. Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for that. It was a lot of what you said was really, really compelling. I have a couple of quick answers, and the one that I want to go into first is actually policing. And private police, because the thing is that this system that you were proposing has actually already happened in American history. Now, Emerican Johnson was correct in that the first police departments in the South grew out of slave catching organizations, but in the North, the first police departments started out as private contractors. And this was a incredibly corrupt and incredibly, what's the word? It was an incredibly corrupt system, and it was also like an incredibly expensive system. So expensive that the businessmen all got together and said, we're paying too much for protection to these private contractors. And these guys are going out, and what they're doing is they're making deals with thieves. And the thief will steal the property. The immediately will be recovered by the officer, and the officer will return it for a reward. So what they said to themselves was, okay, so this police system is not working. We're paying too much money, and these people are corrupt. What we need to do is we need to make it cheaper for ourselves. Let's make it into a public utility. And all of the business owners, or the vast majority of them, got behind this. And you had the very first police department in American history, which was the Boston Police. That is how they were founded, with a push from the very people who are calling for anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism today, which is essentially the petite bourgeoisie business owners. So I'm wondering how you will manage to get around that problem. And then there's a couple of other problems that I see, but I don't want to throw too much at you. I'm wondering, what's the solution to that?
To begin with, I have no idea whether your historical account is true or not. It's not a period I've studied. I know a good deal about 18th and 19th century law enforcement in England, because I've actually written on that subject. And that starts out with a system where criminal enforcement was private. That is to say, there were government courts, and it was the government that hanged somebody when he was convicted. But there was nothing equivalent to our police system. And the police there come in about 1830 in England, the peelers as they were called. But I would have to know what the rules and institutions were that your people were operating under, because were they, for example, themselves liable if somebody sued them for doing something wrong? I should say the business about stealing and then selling it back. I don't know if you've ever seen the Dry Groschen opera, the Threepenny Opera, but I'm
familiar with it, but I haven't seen it.
All right. The central figure of that is based on a historical figure who combined the professions of thief-taker, recoverer of stolen property, and large-scale employer of thieves. And he did that for about 10 years, and they finally caught him and hanged him. But then various people wrote books about it because he was an interesting and colorful character. So that's clearly a problem. But in the system that I'm describing, the police who are dealing with me are the ones of the firm that I've agreed to, that I've hired. I could hire a different firm. If the police who are working for me behave in that way, I will find somebody else to do it. I think, by the way, the idea that the petty bourgeoisie are the supporters of anarcho-capitalism is a little bit optimistic. I'd be delighted to have more supporters of anarcho-capitalism. I think there are probably 2 billionaires I know of who are somewhat sympathetic to those views. But as far as I can tell, most of the anarcho-capitalists are academics, students, people of that sort. So, and I don't think that the business people you're describing, at least in the 19th century, as far as I can tell, as later, businesses, naturally enough, given that there was a government, tried to get the government to do things that would benefit them. Standard example is tariffs, that the relevant economics were worked out by David Ricardo a little over 200 years ago. And I think most economists since have agreed that, with certain exceptions, as a general rule, a tariff hurts the country that imposes it. Nonetheless, with the two notable exceptions of 19th century England and 20th century Hong Kong, pretty nearly every polity had tariffs. And the reason for that, I think, is that the beneficiaries of the tariff are a concentrated and well-organized interest group, a particular industry, 8 firms or something. They can cooperate pretty well to raise money to bribe politicians to pass the tariff. Right. The losers are most of the population.
Yeah, like Chomsky talking about in a developed society, the certain cartels essentially will seize the levers of power and make sure that the government subsidizes them. That's essentially
part of what's odd about it is realizing it's not a matter of certain people get benefited. You can easily enough have a case where the same person is getting $10 at a cost to other people of $20 because he's owns stock in a steel company, and is paying $20 for something that ought to cost $10 because he's flying on an airline, and before deregulation, the government had cartelized the airlines and was pushing the prices up. So it's tempting to think, and many libertarians on my side do, of sort of a ruling class who are getting the benefits. But it's worse than that. It's a system where in one role, I get a benefit that costs you more than I get. In another role, you get a benefit that costs me more than you get. It's sort of
that's a very good point. EJ, do you want to? I have more questions on law enforcement, but do you want to take this?
Well, I just wanted to. I guess I would jump in real quick and first of all just say there are multiple accounts throughout history. You know, like the Homestead strike is probably one of the more well-known examples where the 300 Pinkertons were hired and given Winchester rifles by the Homestead by Henry Clay Frick, who basically hired these mercenaries, this private police force, to go and brutally suppress workers. And I guess that would be one question: is like, how do you stop a capitalist who has accumulated enough wealth to where they can hire a pretty large private army like that to stop workers from collectivizing or from doing anything that they don't want the workers to do? There are plenty of other examples, like the way that Coca-Cola and Ford treated workers in South America, where they would just literally assassinate strike leaders and unionists and that sort of thing. I also wanted to quickly respond and see what you have to say about, you said that warfare is too expensive for most business people to want to reach for in most situations. But I would say if you have an overwhelming force de majeure over, another party, warfare quickly becomes one of the cheaper ways of solving any kind of a dispute. If you know for a fact that you have a much larger power base than whoever you're trying to, having a disagreement with, then that's basically how mafias get started. That's how organized crime gets started. And I would see the state as just a large, overblown form of organized crime. So, and then, the last thing I'll say about that is most wars throughout history have been to profit somebody, to, they've occurred because it was the most expedient way to get a better deal, essentially. So I guess I just wanted to push back a little bit against that idea that warfare is too expensive for these large, powerful capitalists to do, to enact.
If you have a society with enough inequality, you're going to have a hard time getting attractive results with any of the systems you're considering. So far, neither of you has really answered my initial challenge of how do you solve the coordination problem.
I can answer that, but I'll wait.
Just a minute. You will, yes. But if you think about sort of the world we live in, it is true a billionaire has a lot of money, but there are a very small number of billionaires and a very large number of people who aren't. So if you're imagining a system where the rights enforcement agency has 1 million customers and their income is only $50,000 a year, say, that still is $50 billion worth of money, of income, some of which can be spent on getting their rights protected. And you aren't going to find, you're very unlikely to find a oppressive, ultra wealthy person who is willing to spend that kind of sum in order to oppress, because as a general rule, the profit from violating people's rights is lower than the cost to them, and they're therefore willing to spend more. Now, it's true that the richer you are, the more money you're willing to spend for any particular objective, but I think people vastly overestimate how unequal a really modern developed society is. That if you look at, for example, people like to talk about wealth inequality, but if you think about it, if I have $1 billion worth of stock, I'm not really controlling $1 billion worth of resources unless I'm willing to sell it, because that stock is companies. Those companies have to produce what customers want to buy. They have to hire people who are willing to be hired by them in order to stay in business. And if instead I say, well, I own that stock, so the company will produce what I approve of instead, pretty soon I won't have $1 billion worth of stock anymore because the company will go broke. So the right measure of the inequality, I think, the relevant kind of inequality, is income. And if you look at that, I believe it turns out that most of the inequality in the US system is not billionaires, that they have very high income, but they're a very small group. It's the lawyers and doctors and computer programmers. It's the people who have an income of sort of between $100,000 and $400,000 a year, which is a lot, substantially more. I guess that The median, I suppose, is somewhere around 50,000. I don't know exactly what it is, but something on that order. So it's substantially more, but it's not overwhelmingly more. But I guess my real argument is that I don't see a better alternative. I don't see a mechanism. One of the mistakes that people make across the political spectrum, I think, is to define what they want in terms of outcome instead of institutions. So, for example, lots of people would say we want a society that helps the poor and at the cost of the rich. But you say, well, all right. So you set up a society in which the government has got the power to tax people and to spend money. And you find out that some of what it's doing is to help poor people to get their votes. And some of what it's doing is to help rich people to get their votes. That it's pretty common, for example, for local governments to subsidize the opera. The opera is not mostly consumed by poor people. The US heavily subsidizes schooling, in particular college schooling. What does that mean? It means that the roughly top 40% or so of the population, in terms of some mix of family background, intelligence, enterprise, etc., the people who are going to end up as roughly speaking, the top 40% of the income distribution are having the cost of their training paid for by the general public. And that's not unusual. Now, of course, I'm not saying the government's never helped the poor. Of course, they have something to do. Poor people have votes too. But you want to think in any of these systems, you want to ask not what outcome do I want you first ask what outcome do I want my system to produce. You then say, what outcome will the institutions I'm I'm recommending. And I would have to have a clearer idea of the institutions you want. Because there are lots of sort of small scale things that fit what you want and that on the whole I approve of. You mentioned having been involved in historical recreation. If you look at what happens in the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is where I've done most of my historical recreation, there is a fairly lively gift economy. That is, there's a system where people do things, give them away, and there's some understanding that you get some credit from that and other people do things for you. As you may know, I think one or the other of you had written something on Saga period Iceland, and there's a line in Havamal, no man is so wealthy that he objects to receiving a gift in exchange for his gift. And that's how a gift economy works. And it's a more informal than a sort of property trade one. It is a workable mechanism, although I don't think it scales as well as the modern system. But within a relatively small group of people, it certainly does. One of my current projects, one of my hobbies is lapidary work, cutting gemstones. One of the things I want to encourage in the SCA is people making historical jewelry. It therefore bothers me that people in the SCA frequently have glass jewels or have no idea whether the stones in the coronets they're making are really ones used in the Middle Ages. So I put up a standing offer on Facebook that if somebody's actually making period jewelry based on real pieces, I will donate. I will cut and donate the cabochons for doing it. That's a gift economy. I get a certain amount of status out of it. I can achieve something I want to achieve in improving the SCA a little bit. But that's not the way I want to depend on supporting myself. And I think that, in most contexts, is not a workable way of supporting yourself. And that most of what I do and most of what I depend on involves strangers far away who don't know enough about me to share my objectives.
Really quickly, anyway, by the way, what was a friend of mine wanted me to call you this, but I didn't want to mispronounce it. What's your SCA name? Your Duke?
Caryadoc is the way I pronounce it,
Duke,
but it's really
my liege Duke Caryadoc.
It's supposed to be a European pronunciation of an Arabic name, and I don't speak Arabic. I could show you somewhere where somebody who did speak Arabic actually constructed a plausible basis for it, and my original basis for it was largely a misunderstanding of some historical sources. So I respond to any of about 3 different pronunciations of that name. I don't really.
Okay, good. Well, okay, Lord Caryadoc and Robert, now you need to make 1,000 alts and like my YouTube channel 1,000 times. I actually have an answer for what you were talking about. And I agree this is a big problem because money is essentially, it's not real. It's an intelligent system that we use to expedite human cooperation. And I agree that it works and it's worked, but it has a number of very large bugs. What I would actually recommend, and I'm not sure if the technology is quite there, is what's called swarm technology. Now, swarm technology has been around since the 1930s, but lately there's been some huge jumps in what it is capable of doing. Most notably, a few years ago, a swarm was able to outcompete, outcompete both the experts, which we can consider that the economic planners, and also the markets, which were the Vegas odds, to properly predict the top 3 winners of the Kentucky Derby. This particular means of technology, and this is outside of my field, like I don't study this, so you would need to get people who really study this to go into it. But what it was able to do was to tap into individual inputs of everyone and create a kind of intelligence that was smarter than the sum of its parts, in much the same way that a bee, no individual bee can understand proper hive placement, but together they come together and create the hive. So I think this technology could be adapted to make the kinds of important economic decisions that we are currently doing via market mechanisms with less of the problems of markets, because again, the problem is markets are biased towards previous actors within the market and tend to have a snowball effect. So that's one issue. The second thing that I'll say, and I think EJ can kind of talk about this, is we have seen some very promising early attempts at this kind of coordination in the anarcho-syndicalist movement. Particularly, you can look to the anarcho-syndicalists in revolutionary Catalonia. I mean, again, not only were they successful militarily in the sense that they were able to get farmers and factory workers with antique rifles.
They were ultimately unsuccessful militarily, right? The communists.
Well, they were successfully militarily. They defeated the Spanish military in the region, collectivized the city for 3 years. Buenaventura Durruti raised an army of between 6,000 and 10,000 anarchists, marched from Barcelona to Madrid, and was unfortunately killed either by a Bolshevik assassin, a misfiring gun, or a fascist sniper, depending upon who you ask. But the point is that the anarchists were not defeated militarily; they were betrayed. And in the 3 years that they ran Barcelona, those were times of excessive plenty. There was a massive agricultural boom that led from overturning the previous latifundian system and irrigating land that was previously unirrigated. And you did not see stuff like the black market return until the Soviets forced property rights to return to the area. And you can look this up. It's covered in Adam Hochschild's Spain in Our Hearts, which is a brilliant book from a liberal historian. The fact is that the anarchists were not, their rule did not collapse because people's basic needs were not met. Their rule did not collapse because they could not handle militarily. Their rule collapsed from, one, having false friends, the Bolsheviks suppressed them, and 2, being so isolated from the rest of the world that they were denied the kinds of weapons that they needed to defeat Franco, who had the support of Texaco, who had the support of Hitler's Condor Legion, and had legionnaires sent in from Mussolini. The Western liberal powers did not back them. And we can see this story play out again in recent history with regard to the PKK-YPG, where again, with Maury Bookchin's Democratic Confederalism, this organization was one of the top fighters against ISIS, and unlike in Spain, they were equipped by the Americans, and in fact are still around, but were yet again betrayed by false friends, this time by Trump, allowing the Turks to attack them. But they maintained their idea, they maintained some of their territory, and they signed a deal with Assad. I don't have high hopes for that because Assad is a monster. But the fact of the matter is that as we've seen these attempts at building a better world within the shell of the old, they're very, very promising. And yes, we haven't gotten to a point where they've done anything beyond the regional level. I would like to see it on the national or international level. But, there was also a time when people thought that, capitalism and democracy would never work and we'd never get out from under feudalism. So I think what we need to look at is, while these are not proof positive that these systems can work, I think this is proof positive that we need to be looking closer into these systems, and so that we can take care of some of the bugs in the monetary system.
First, a small historical point. Mm-hmm. What democracy replaced was not feudalism, it was absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy is what replaced feudalism.
Good point. Thank you.
And on the whole, I tend to think feudalism is probably better than absolute monarchy.
I would
absolute
agree.
monarchy looks good because it concentrates lots of wealth in the capital, and so it makes beautiful buildings for us to look at and such, but at some cost to the people who are paying that wealth.
I would agree with you
that,
entirely on that, particularly that less people are lost in
my impression
warfare.
is that different people have different accounts of the Catalonian case, and I don't really know enough to know whether your account is accurate or not. But I know that in my society, there are no legal restrictions that prevent a group of workers from setting up a workers' co-op. There are some firms organized that way, but not very much, not very many, but there are some. Now, you can't get a capitalist to give you your capital assets. On the other hand, if you think about how rich modern societies are relative to real subsistence, if it really was important, you could save, a third of your salary for 5 or 10 years, and that would probably, depending on the company, be enough to buy out all of its physical assets. And set it up doesn't seem to happen very much. And I conclude.
I'd like to talk on that for a moment, because as a former capitalist, so the one of the main reasons, actually probably the most common reason that a business will fail, is undercapitalization. So the average startup cost for a business, and I have links to resources for all, to sources for all this stuff I can post if necessary. But so the average startup for a small business that lasts more than 2 years is about $30,000. The average worker in the United States of America makes about $30 in real income, and has less than $1,000, around $30,000. I have a link to that if that's under dispute. But
say of real income, I don't know what you mean.
Well, $30,000 is what, not per capita, so you're not taking billionaires.
Take the median. I don't think the median salary of an employed worker is not anything as low as $30,000. I'm pretty sure. You could show me your sources.
Let me find my source here. It's here we go. Real personal income in the USA.
If you need to screen share, you can go ahead and do that too.
Yeah. Well, it's from the Fred Economic Data, Economic Research, real median personal income in the United States of America. It's currently sitting at about $33,706 as of 2018.
When you say real.
From the U.S. Census Bureau.
No, but real income normally means income adjusted for inflation. That's the usual meaning of the term real income. And so you'd have to know, are those in current dollars, or are those in? This is as of 2018 according to the U.S. Census. So but what are the dollars it's being measured in? You're saying that it's real income, not income. Nominal income would be the income, the number of dollars people get. Real income would be the number of dollars divided by the amount of inflation since whatever date they're defining it in terms of. So you'd have to know what that was. You see the problem? Real income is a technical. Perhaps
if I send you the link, you can tell me. But from what I understand, it's the actual income that an average worker makes. It's the median income. Sorry, not average, but median.
Let me see if I can. If I just
the point of the matter is, what would you say? Okay, so what would you think that the average worker, a typical worker that in the United States, what figure would you like to throw out there? Because it doesn't really.
Yes.
What I'm saying doesn't hinge so much on this one fine detail. So you can give me a figure.
The figure, I'm just looking up a figure, and it says that the median personal income for all full-time workers in 2017 was $865 a week. So if you multiply that by 50, it ends up as 40-some thousand.
Okay, so it doesn't really make much of a difference.
But in any case, suppose you're making $40,000 a year. You have
$1,000 in savings or less, which is also 69%.
That's your choice. If you're talking about a system so much better that people should be willing to have a revolution for it, a revolution is a whole lot more expensive than living like a hippie for 5 years.
I don't think that it's a choice, because when I was a capitalist and I had workers that were working with me closely in my office, and during the financial meltdown of 2007, 2008, 2009, and I was getting a stack of 20 or 30 resumes coming in per week because there was so much need for jobs. My employees definitely didn't want to work for me. I had a few employees who wanted to move to New York, who wanted to get other jobs, who wanted to do other things, but they were tied down to my company, and basically couldn't quit. They were essentially coerced by the market and by my position of authority over them into doing whatever I told them to do for that period of time. So it wasn't really, there are other power dynamics. I wanted to mention this. There are other power dynamics beyond simply the dynamic of, I have $50,000, we can all collectively. So if I'm your employer and you wanted to have a dispute with me with your personal police department or conflict resolution department or whatever, and I'm your employer, I have other options. I could fire you. There are other power dynamics.
And you can fire him. You can quit. Right?
It's yes, but look at the COVID-19 context right now. If somebody wants to quit working at Taco Bell,
the fact that you're constrained not to always do what you want is somehow something imposed on you. In order for you, somebody's got to produce that food.
Why can't they collectively own the means of production is the big question.
But in that case, so they collectively own the means of production, and that means that somebody's got to compel the farmer to work.
That's not how it's worked for thousands of years in agricultural societies. I mean, if you look at the work of Yochai Benkler, who talks about crowdsourcing and collectivization, and does comparative studies of all the fields of science right now, they're all moving towards a more mutual aid, crowdsourced, collectivist form, including businesses, because it's fine that what Benkler is finding is that all these fields of study are starting to move away from that. Everybody is competing with each other and everybody is pitted against each other to this more mutual aid aligned principle. Now, what Benkler found is that in some instances, people are cooperative. In some instances, they are competitive. It has a lot to do with the system design. So in systems that are designed more for cooperation, people tend to be more cooperative. I think that kind of makes sense. But in large scale, collectivization and crowdsourcing and working together is becoming more the norm in all these fields of study. And if you look, for instance, at something that I've worked in, which is marketing and media production, that sort of thing, and web development, that sort of thing. 20 years ago, nobody would have ever thought, they would have thought it was ridiculous to say, oh, why don't we put something out there and we can just let people voluntarily come up and crowdsource information for us to use for a model for this project. 20 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room. Now it's the norm. Now it's very much.
That sounds to me like the way in which the academic world has been running for something well over a century, right? I mean, the open source approach to software is really an application to the producing of software of what's really been the academic model for a very long time. And that is that people write articles mainly in order to improve their reputation, in order that they can get jobs at universities or other places, just as people write open source software in order to improve their reputation so that employers will hire them. That the source has to be public. If you write an article and you say, here's my conclusion, but I won't tell you the evidence, nobody's going to listen to it. So that's not something new, but the question is, in the society as it now exists, there are no laws preventing people from interacting in this way. Some people, some of the time, do, and yet
there are circumstances. Even if they're not laws, there are other forms of coercion. So there are circumstances that can coerce somebody. Do you agree with that? There are other forms of coercing people. So, for instance, if we were on I hate to use
can I jump in real quick, because I have kind of a personal thing here that I think might be able to illustrate this. So one of the reasons I first went to Occupy Wall Street was my wife. My wife was diagnosed with Crohn's disease and needed about 4 surgeries. Now, and this is a lifelong illness. She actually, even to this day, we cannot have her not have health insurance for even a week. As a direct result of that, the types of careers that I can pursue are limited. And my choices are limited as to who I can actually take a job from and what I can do, because ultimately I'm dealing with a spouse that, if she doesn't get her medicine, could die. And a lot of people are dealing with these similar problems. I even think, and you don't hear a lot of politicians talk about this, but I even think that the push against universal healthcare is in a way a push to help either directly or either intentionally or unintentionally, to help the larger corporations that are the only ones who can actually provide healthcare compete against the smaller corporations and the smaller startups that can't afford these ridiculous insurance rates that we have in the United States. So right there's an example of a outside coercive force that puts a lot of pressure on my individual choices of what job I can take and when I can quit and when I can't.
I have a problem with the way you're using the term coercion, because I think of coercion as something that people do to you. But in your sense, we are all coerced by reality. right? I am coerced in a very serious fashion, which you aren't yet, but you will be. And that is that given my present age, it is unlikely that I will be alive 30 years from now. You can call that coercion if you like, but I don't think it's useful to use the same term for that as the form of coercion that comes from somebody coming up to me, sticking a gun in my ribs and saying, do what I tell you to, or I will shoot you. Those are different.
What if I say, do what I tell you to do, or you will starve?
In any set of institutions, whatever your institutions are, you are going to be constrained by reality, that there are going to be things you want to do. If the woman I want to marry won't marry me, I am coerced. That is to say, I can't get something of enormous importance to me. I don't think you can say the fact that in this society, people sometimes end up having no choices other than the ones they're making.
It's not sometimes though. It's like, it's very, very common. I would say it's the norm for most people to have a very small set of choices where they're confined to work for a capitalist or starve. And it's not a situation where they're voluntarily going in and saying, okay, I'll work for you and then you pay me. And then it's not this voluntary
but that is the
fantasy.
Deal.
Because if you don't work for, what if somebody who is working for Taco Bell right now during a pandemic going to do if they don't want to work for that Taco Bell? What are their options? Realistically, work for another capitalist.
Company.
Exactly.
If they're not in California, they get to work for Uber or Lyft.
And I've been an Uber driver, and I can tell you that's a very coercive relationship. And it's not just a coercive relationship between me and Uber, it's a coercive relationship between me and the passengers as well, because if you get less than a 4.5 star rating, you lose your job. So basically, if somebody just says you didn't do a perfect job, then at least that was the way it was when I was driving. So I'm sitting here where I have this coercive relationship where I have passengers in the backseat of my car who, in many cases, were saying things that under normal circumstances, I would have kicked them the hell out of my car, but I couldn't do that because my job was on the line. Now, the point I want to make really quickly, because I think you were talking about reality and that we're all subject to the material conditions of reality. I completely agree with that. I want to quote John Locke here. Who said, John Locke, it can be coercion, but it can also be a positive thing as well. Nature is nature. It is what it is. Reality is what it is. So it's just it's the rules we all have to play by. John Locke said, the earth is a gift from nature. And if you go back far enough, all wealth that has ever been accumulated, going back far enough, it was acquired by force, because originally earth belonged to nobody, land belonged to nobody, the means of production belonged to nobody. And to say that is another way of saying it was all owned collectively by humanity, and at some point somebody said, this is my land, and if you want to use it, you do what I tell you to, or I will violently force you to do other.
I don't object.
I think you are confusing two different alternatives to private property. One of them is social ownership, and that requires some mechanism by which somebody decides who can use the land, right? If the land is owned by all of us, there is something, however it's organized, that says that once you've planted wheat on it, I do or don't get to plow it up for doing something else. The other is a commons, which is the situation when you have no property. A commons is the situation where anybody can use it, so that the air is pretty much a commons in our society.
Language.
The ocean is largely, language is a commons. That's right. Language.
It's not a commons in our society though, because a corporation can pollute it, and I can't do anything to stop them. So you can't really say that I
makes it a commons.
Same level of ownership
That's
as
the
a CEO.
One of the problems with a commons is that people can use it in ways that reduce its value to others. But they can't stop you from using it.
And the only way that I can think of to solve this problem of making decisions is through democracy, which democracy can be designed well, or it can be designed poorly. But how can you decide how much we pollute the air as an individual? That's not something that any individual should ever get to make that decision about, because it affects every other human being on the planet. So how do you solve the problem?
Yes, if you look at the chapter on market failure in the Market for Law in third edition of Machinery, one of the examples, I give a couple of examples, there are cases where there isn't a good market solution. And the question is, do you put up with a suboptimal situation, which is going to be more air pollution than will be desirable, given that the alternative is having a government with the power to do a great deal of damage, as governments in practice do. I'm not a utopian. I don't think you can get a system that does all good things. But going back,
and one of the basic principles.
Hold on, American.
If nobody propertizes,
I'm listening. I'm sorry. I'm listening.
If nobody propertizes the land, what you have is a commons, and the problem of morally justifying propertizing land is a hard problem. I make an attempt at it in the 3rd edition of Machinery, but it's not a very successful attempt. I don't know anybody else who's done a better one. But what I think is clear is that if you don't propertize land, people starve. Because if that would include your social propertization as well. If anytime I do anything with land, everybody else is free to walk over it, plow it up, harvest the wheat I planted, and so forth, then we starve to death. And
what I would say is,
and it seems to me that saying it belongs to all of us, that raises the same moral problem as saying it belongs to me, because it belongs to all of us means that although the corporate body did not create the land any more than I created the land, the corporate body claims the right to keep me off of it, because someone's got to decide.
I mean, I would say this is why anarchists consider property rights via possession and use as opposed to by state deed. But what I wanted to bring up really quickly here, because we are getting into the weeds and stuff, and there's a bunch of things I'd like to jump on, but sure. I want to kind of go back to police and defense. And this is my question. So we have, let's assume in your anarcho-capitalist world, we have private police, private courts, private prisons, all operating for profit, correct?
Correct.
All right. What stops private police from voluntarily combining with private prisons and a private legislature and
the government?
Yeah, and essentially creating a modern slaving state where they have the incentive to lock up as many people as possible, put them to work in the private prisons, and nobody can stop them here.
That probably isn't optimal from their standpoint. Probably if they could recreate a government, they want to leave people moderately free because they'll be much more productive that way, and then tax the whole lot.
So ideology.
They're doing it now.
No. I'm just saying as a practical matter. I don't deny that what you're describing is a potential problem. I'm just saying you have your version of what the problem looks like. It seems to me is a good deal uglier than the likely one. If you think about actual societies which are undemocratic, they generally are not slave societies, however much our rhetoric may call it that. But the answer is that if you end up with only a very small number of private rights enforcement agencies, then there is a serious risk that will happen, which is a point I made in the 3rd edition of Machinery. On the other hand, if there's a fairly large number, we observe in ordinary markets that cartels sometimes happen if you have 2 or 3 firms, but you aren't going to see a cartel in an industry with 100 firms, because anytime a few firms get together and try to offer worse terms to people, it pays other firms to take their customers away. So you don't see a cartel of restaurants. You don't see the only cartel of barbers you get is the one that the government supports, namely barber licensing in many cities, which holds down the number of barbers, but you don't get it happening through the private market. So I think the answer is that but of course the same issue arises in your system. Given any system at all, you have some mechanism for preventing people from doing bad things.
Sure, but it's disincentivized.
What?
In a left libertarian system, that is disincentivized because you cannot become wealthy in a left libertarian system.
What do you mean you can't? You mean the system says you can't?
No, I mean literally
you can have people who are working as slaves for you. You, of course, will use other language to describe what they're doing, but someone is controlling the food, someone is controlling the land.
Right, but for instance, let's say that the land is controlled essentially by a non-hierarchical militia, where everyone draws the same pay.
How does the non-hierarchical militia decide who gets to plant wheat on this piece of land?
Usually via direct democracy. That's how anarchists have traditionally done it. That's what we did.
Explain what you mean by direct democracy. Do you mean you have a vote on every issue with the use of a large area of land goes to what?
Not on every issue, but on important issues that affect all of us. Usually it's done through a general assembly. So we did this at Occupy Wall Street, for instance. Certain things that were less important, people just went and did and handled on their own. Other times when there was a big decision to be made that affects the entire community, we would use direct democracy and people would vote via consensus. And so
what happens in that system? What happens in that system if just the equivalent of what you were worrying about in my system, I put together a coalition of 60% of the people, and we say, well, we can do whatever we want. We're going to get a majority of every vote. So we are going to allocate all of the land to us, for us to control, and the rest
I can answer this. Okay, so because this is essentially how a state forms, is when you have a group of people, a minority of people, in my opinion, who come together and they build an apparatus to coerce other people into doing what they say. So the solution to that is always insurrection, you know, and if you have a system where, and that's just being, you know, it doesn't have to be violent insurrection, but, you know, if there is coercive force being applied to a group of people, it's incumbent upon them, and they have the right to rise up and resist that coercive authority. Now, under a anarcho-capitalist system, if they have if the capitalist has all the wealth and can hire the more cops,
but the capitalist doesn't have all the wealth. The capitalists, at least looking at the ones we have here, capitalists have of the total income much less than half of it. And that's what's buying things.
What I might point out, by the way, is
Yep.
we're assuming that all of these states, like when you talk about it being two or companies, are all operating on like a single currency. Whereas I think in reality, when we've seen this, they would be minting their own currency and passing it out to like people like in company towns.
Company stores.
Yeah, which was a huge problem and like caused stuff like the Battle of Blair Mountain, where the Pinkertons and like even like freaking airplanes dropping incendiaries on striking miners happened, you know, as a result of these companies. Like there have been a number of times when there is no actual state apparatus and companies behave the way that they want to behave. A great example is the British East India Company. And I mean, they starved 10% of the Indian subcontinent to death within a single year. I mean, they cut a swath of destruction that we are still dealing with today, and it didn't stop until they broke on the rocks of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is where empires go to die. So, like, I feel like what we're seeing.
Wait a minute. The East India Company had lost its control over India quite a long time before the first Afghan War, if I'm not remembering my history correctly.
I mean, it may have been. I may be simplifying the history there, but the point is that the East India Company outside of England's borders behaved as. If you're going
to base your argument on historical facts, you really have to pay attention to what they are, because it's too easy. History is this huge kaleidoscope of all sorts of different things, and I mean, this is like anything.
I prefer to talk about things happening now anyway, because to be honest, the material conditions have changed so much. Like what we have today. So I want to go back to the reality thing again, because I think that is very important, and I'm glad you raised that point. The fact of the matter is, you know, one of the main reasons that we come together as a society and don't all just live as individuals is because we have material needs that we need to survive. We need food, we need clothing, we need shelter, we need all these things, right?
Right.
And it's been estimated in recent studies and in studies going all the way back to Benjamin Franklin that if every able person contributed to meaningful work, not the kind of BS jobs that we have under capitalism, but if everyone contributed in a meaningful way to the production of what we need to meet our material conditions, then we would all only have to work. I mean, Benjamin Franklin said, I think 20 to 25 hours per week, but certainly we wouldn't have to work as much as workers are forced to work today under capitalism, often doing jobs that are not productive at all.
If you would like to have the real wage that Benjamin Franklin's contemporaries have, you can do it quite easily for a good deal less than 24 hours a day. If you compare what hourly wages are now to what hourly wages are then, that you're making the mistake people often make of assuming that there is somehow a fixed standard of what it takes to, you know, live a decent life. And in fact, if you look at it, you will find in Benjamin Franklin's time.
Framework.
One moment, just 1 second. I like to say that Dr. Huemer has actually been able to make it, so he's going to be entering into the discussion. I'm
Very
sorry,
good.
Dr. Huemer. We are kind of wrapping up the end of the discussion, but I'm glad you're able to make it.
I will shut up then and let Michael handle things.
Sorry, I guess I was confused about when we were doing this, so I was not here at the appropriate time.
Well, I'm glad you're here now, so thank you so much for coming.
Yep.
But yeah, just feel free to jump into the discussion.
Is it worth having Michael do his prepared talk, or do we think that given that I already had the amount I had, it's not appropriate?
I think since we're going to be wrapping it up here, we can just continue in our discussion, and then we'll get to questions.
And maybe we can work Dr. Huemer into a future debate as well, so we can get his perspective out.
Definitely.
Because I will say, you know, it's getting a little contentious here, but honestly, I'm really enjoying this discussion. Mm-hmm. It's very stimulating, and you know, Dr. Friedman, it's you have not disappointed.
But I guess my complaint, in a sense, is that your answer to my how do you solve the coordination problem all consists of historical assertions that I'm not in a good position to check whether they're correct or not. And the nice thing, I mean, it may sound odd, but the nice thing about theory over facts is a theory you can look at in your own head.
Well, I would recommend, so if you want to know about my assertions, you can read The East India Company and the Natural World. That's where this history comes from, and it's pretty monstrous.
I've had lots of experience with reading different accounts of some historical sequence of events and finding that they are telling very, very different stories. So I'd rather argue, if I can, by not having you tell me that you think this worked at some point in the past in some way. I want you to explain
okay, so can I just really...
why it can't work now, or explain in theory how you coordinate things without a market and prices.
Can I suggest, let me respond to that really quickly, and then maybe Dr. Heumer can respond, but maybe just to keep things moving. So basically, first thing I want to say is that anarchists are not, utopian anarcho-communists are not utopian idealists. One of the things that Rudolf Rocker, an early 20th century anarcho-communist, said was that I'm not an anarchist because anarchism is the end goal, but because there is no end goal. And we realize that as we move to try to deconstruct unjust hierarchies and dismantle coercive forces in our society, it is a very long-term project, and it will be going on for countless generations probably. It's going to take a long time to dismantle all of these hierarchies, but the point is to be inherently skeptical of hierarchies and of coercion, and to dismantle them as we are able over time. Okay, so and in doing so, I believe, and this is something where my fellow ANCOMs sometimes disagree with me, but I believe that one of the most important practices we have to engage with as libertarians, as anarchists, is the development and the design and the improvement of systems of democracy. Because when we are talking about the common weal, when we are talking about things that have collective impact on all of us, like the air, like food production, all of these things that we all need to survive, and land that produces those things, democracy might not be perfect. And the way we have democracies designed right now might not be perfect. There might be several flaws, but they can be improved. The errors can be found and dismantled. And if democracy fails, then it's incumbent on the oppressed people who do not have a voice in society to, through direct action. And I think that right-wing libertarians also believe in direct action and fighting for our own liberty.
Unless they're NAP people, but yeah.
But yeah, and then to that, I would just respond that property itself violates the NAP, because again, going back far enough, at some point, somebody aggressed somebody to own that land, because again, at the beginning of things, it was all owned by nobody, which means it was all owned by everybody. So I guess that's kind of, I don't know if that's enough.
Not owned by everybody. There wasn't an everybody structure that could tell you this is the person who gets in this. You shouldn't confuse a joint ownership with commons.
What I might point out with regard to like the tragedy of the commons, because I think that's what you're getting at.
No, I'm just pointing out that a commons is a commons.
Yeah. Well, commons can still be managed, though. Again, which is why anarchists have traditionally done property rights in terms of occupancy and use, in much the same way that the Native Americans, or most Native American tribes, they used the territory when they were on it, and when they abandoned it, other tribes could come in and use it. Now, and this is kind of a natural way that humans organize themselves before the state, and it can come in and write, laws and enforce those laws with hierarchical police forces. Now, I do have a question, though, about coercion. I want to get to the nature of coercion, and Dr. Friedman or Mike Huemer, you guys can both answer this one. Imagine this, hypothetically. You are hanging off a cliff, and you're holding onto a rope. And there is a man holding the other end of that rope. And he says to you, "Give me your watch or I drop my end." Has that man robbed you?
Mike, do you want to take it?
I don't know if that counts as robbery, but I don't know if that matters. So, is he being an asshole? Yeah. So,
yeah, but is it coercive, or is it a free choice to give him your watch?
How did you get into that situation?
Well, hypothetically, it doesn't matter for the purpose of this, but if we're talking about capitalism, essentially what I'm getting at is we were all, unless you were born into the 1%, you were born on a cliff. like
Yeah,
hanging from that rope, and you have to serve a capitalist under the conditions that capitalist has set.
I mean, I think you have false factual assumptions. Okay, but I mean, let me tell you a different hypothetical, because this happens this happens actually. So, you're diagnosed with cancer, and they tell you that you need surgery, and if you don't get the surgery, you will die. And then they say, please sign this form, right, where you agree to get the surgery. And of course, then you're going to be charged a certain amount of money, right? Hopefully you have insurance, otherwise you'll be cleaned out. Okay, but you still probably have to pay something even if you have insurance. So is that a valid agreement?
No. I would consider it invalid, because again, that is holding somebody's life over them to prompt some sort of behavior out of them, and I would consider that coercive.
So
I mean, if the doctor gave you the cancer, then I would agree that was coercive and wrong. And I think that it's very widely accepted. So he didn't give you the cancer. I think it's very widely accepted that that's a valid agreement.
I mean, it's a valid agreement on its face, but if you look at it from a larger perspective, another good example of this might be, and this is a real life example. I had a friend who he'd given up on ever being able to own a house. And then what happened was he moved home, and the house that his grandfather had built with his bare hands, he was invited to live in it, and it was wanted to be gifted to him by his grandmother. His grandfather had passed away quite some time ago. But then what wound up happening was that the grandmother took a fall and needed critical end-of-life care in a nursing home. Now, the thing was that they did not have the money to pay for this critical end-of-life care. The state would provide Medicaid, but only if all assets were liquidated at fair market value. So my friend was forced to get a mortgage to buy his own house and pay a bank for 30 years just to get the critical end-of-life care that the elderly need. Now, this seems to me to be an incredibly abusive relationship where huge corporations benefit off of the things that cannot be avoided within human life. We cannot avoid the pangs of hunger. We cannot avoid the sufferings of disease, old age, and death. And there are people growing rich off of this and exerting their control over our behavior and over our property by holding that over us. Now, I would consider that a coercive relationship, and I
would describe it as people getting rich off of helping us with those problems, right?
I mean helping, yes, but
there's a big difference between if they're creating the problem and if they're addressing the problem.
Well, they're taking advantage of a problem,
I didn't mean to cut
which is why I did the hanging by a rope off the cliff, because I want to see, like, the point of it is not that it's real. I just want to see, like, where you guys draw the line in terms of coercion, because oftentimes
can I make one point really quickly, which is
sure.
that this kind of rhetoric is, I think, very dangerous, because it can be used to excuse major instances of oppression. So, for instance, there was the whole, like, happy slave myth during the Civil War or antebellum period in the South, where I'm from, where people said, oh, we give them food, we give them clothing, we give them everything they need, they're very happy. This justifies the slavery because we're helping them. And Andrew Jackson made many speeches and wrote many essays about how sending the Native Americans west during displacement was actually doing them a big favor, because we're giving them all this land, and we're going to preserve their culture.
None of those were voluntary agreements. Those were all compelled agreements.
And that's what we're saying, is that there's these kinds of patterns.
Wait a minute. I have a question for both of you. Are you murderers? If you think about it, wait a minute. I don't know. No, I think by your standards you are. Because after all, you live in a very rich society. You could certainly save 10% of your income if it was sufficiently important. And 10% of your income could almost certainly save several lives in the third world where there are very poor people. So if you really want to take the position that failing to help someone is morally equivalent to hurting someone, which I think is the position you're taking, then you have to label yourselves as murderers.
You're making assumptions here. First of all, I give more than 10% of my income to fundraisers every year, and I could document that if
could you give more?
But that's not the point. I give as much as I'm able now. But the point is, I also
do you save as many lives as you can?
I do try to, yes. I do try to, through the process of direct action, mutual aid, and liberation struggle, I do my best. And I believe that every anarcho-communist that is principled and believes in these things does put the liberty of what we always say is nobody is free until everybody is free.
So okay? I believe that you're taking action
to
your political ideology, but are you taking action to save the lives in the most efficient way that could be done? Right?
I try every day to save as many lives in the most efficient way as I can through the framework that I understand. I do. Now, maybe there are improvements that can be made. Maybe there are mistakes that I make sometimes, etc.
Well, let's slightly change.
I don't want to make this about individuals. Change the question.
Do you think that almost everyone in the world is a murderer?
No, but again, I don't think that this murderer. I
don't get the question.
Yeah, I'm not seeing how
almost nobody in the world is saving as many lives as they can. If you are, then you're one of
let me turn it around. Okay,
in a million
I do believe that I, as a United States of American citizen, have a responsibility and an obligation to do everything that I can to stop the United States government from, enacting imperialist war, from building this giant police state that murders and imprisons people. So I do think that by being a part of the society and having whatever benefits I get from being an American citizen, although I'm trying to change that, I do want to change my citizenship as soon as possible. But as long as I'm a citizen of the USA, I do believe that it's incumbent. And even if I somehow change my citizenship, I would still do everything I could to stop any coercive force.
I would say ethically it's incumbent on us all to do everything within reason that we can to help our fellow man to make a good faith effort. I don't think it's a good idea for us to sacrifice ourselves for others necessarily.
Are you saying that both of you are living entirely on beans, right?
You're making this an individualistic problem. You're setting this up in individualistic terms where I have to, as an individual, meet some purity test. But we're talking about systemic problems here. And systemically, we are trying to change the system. We are trying to do what we think is the best strategy to change the system to save lives, because we don't think that it's an individual problem where Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or any individual given capitalist.
I think we've gotten sidetracked from the point that David Friedman was trying to make, right?
Well, I mean, the point here, I don't quite understand the point, because it's essentially an ad hominem argument. Like, even if he was right, like, let's say I was a murderer, like, not even in the sense.
The point is not to attack you. Right. The point is, like, it looks like you're endorsing a moral principle, which implies that almost everyone is equivalent to a murderer, and that seems very implausible.
I mean, I don't. Let
me put it this way: when I was a capitalist, and I had an employer-employee relationship with people, where I was sending somebody out and I was getting $100 from the client, putting $50 of that into overhead, paying the employee $10, and then I was pocketing $40 for myself. And I did some work, so maybe that would accumulate to about $10 or $15, $20 worth of labor, whatever. But whatever, the profit that I'm taking was theft. Okay, and at that time, I was a thief, in my opinion, and I was stealing labor value from my employees. Right. So if I were currently doing that, then you could say that I'm being hypocritical. But what I'm trying to say is these systems of coercion are the problem, and we as individuals, we can obviously go tit for tat all day on what the best decision for an individual to make is, but what we're debating right now is not individual actions, but it's what system for society saves the most lives, prevents the most harm, reduces coercion, reduces suffering as much as possible.
I would also add that proving a person a hypocrite doesn't prove them wrong.
Let me jump in here really fast. We are actually going to be having to wrap this up, but I'm going to give the last word here to Dr. Huemer, since he wasn't able to really give his perspective on things. So, Dr. Huemer, if you want to go ahead and give your thoughts on everything, we'll wrap up the discussion and then head into Q&A.
Okay, I mean, I had a speech that I was going to give, but I think I should not try to do that because of the time. But I was going to make the argument that I think anarcho-socialism is unstable in the sense that I think it will evolve into capitalism. And basically, I would say, well, there's no state to prevent somebody from setting up a capitalist enterprise. And then I just think that once there is one, it's going to outcompete the socialist businesses, partly because the anarcho-socialist businesses are going to be providing social services, which the capitalist businesses will not. And partly because I think, can't go into this in detail, but I just think that the capitalist-run businesses are going to be more economically efficient and things like that. So, if anarcho-socialism were to be set up, I would be happy because I would then expect it to evolve to anarcho-capitalism. We know why state socialism doesn't evolve into capitalism is because the government shuts you down when you try to start your own business. The point that we were just talking about before this, like, I think that, Brenton and Emerican were misunderstanding David Friedman's point. It was not to accuse you of hypocrisy. Like, you are just like a random example of a person who does not seem like a murderer, right? The point is not that you're hypocritical. It's that if you think that there's no relevant distinction between failing to help somebody and harming someone, then there's no distinction between failing to save as many lives as possible and murdering people. And if you think that, then you think almost everyone is equivalent to a murderer, because hardly anyone is saving as many lives as they can. And then that just really doesn't seem true, right? Just like, it seems like there's a big difference between us and, Ted Bundy, right?
Can I answer that? Can I respond to that, or do we just need to go straight into the questions?
Yeah, we're gonna have to go straight in. Also, since you guys started, we're gonna have to have the right to libertarians end.
That's fair. Mike, we should have a debate later, because I actually, this is fascinating, and I do actually really want to talk about this.
Good.
Awesome. Well, that's a really great debate. Thank you all for coming out and taking your time. We can definitely get into questions now. The first one is from Lehman. He says, at all of the debaters, what are your thoughts on centricism?
On what?
On centrism.
Centrism. I don't know what centrism means.
Being a centrist.
Just like being in the middle of the political spectrum.
Politically centrist.
The compromise position where it's like we shouldn't be an extremist on any end, and we all, it's a position between a Republican and a Democrat in the U.S. context.
I think all of us are quite a long distance from centrist.
Yes,
fair to say.
Yeah.
One side wants to commit genocide. The other side doesn't want to commit genocide. Maybe we do a little genocide.
Yeah. What I always say is that centrism is just supporting the status quo. So if you like the status quo, you're a centrist. All
right. Next one is from Dave Allo. F in the chat for Mike Huemer's connection. People were sad that you weren't here.
I'm sad too.
We're so glad you were able to come for this last part here. Next one is from Silent Zero. If you were a businessman, why didn't you keep going and give your ownership of your business away to your workers?
I did. I gave my business to my workers. My biggest business was a video production company, and I did give it to my workers, and they ran it successfully, I think, to this day. Oh, so, and they did a really good job owning it collectively, and it's a very good success story for collectivist ownership of the means of production. And in fact, I'll say that we had a web development aspect of that business, and I made a lot of mistakes, and my employees took that part of the business and grew it after I left, because they are actually expert web developers and web designers, and they know that business, and they have what I can't remember who said this, but they had the kind of the authority of the shoemaker, which means that if somebody has expertise in something, we do yield some benefit of the doubt to them and give them some credence when making decisions. And if I had done that more as a top-down capitalist when running my business and listened to those employees more instead of wearing the capitalist hat and being like, I'm the boss, it's my way or the highway, we probably would have grown and made more money earlier on. But once I gave it to them, that part of the business grew and expanded. I mean, this is anecdotal, you can believe it or not, but it's true, and it's my lived experience. So yeah, I did give my biggest.
I believe it's true, but the question is if it is generally true, if in general businesses will do that.
Cooperatives do tend to be more efficiently run than capitalist businesses across the board.
Yeah, there's a lot of data behind that. The biggest problem with cooperatives is not that they don't do better than capitalist businesses, like actually serving it. The issue is serving stockholders, because they don't turn as large of a profit over, and so they don't attract the kind of investment that
they don't get those hockey stick things that venture capitalists require. But also just undercapitalization. It's a lot harder for a collective of people to start. Like if you have 50 workers, it sounds great because we can put all our money together, but starting a company that can support 50 workers takes a tremendous amount of capital. So, I mean, just in terms of real estate alone and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, I guess we're getting into the weeds, but yeah, that's my response to that.
Next question is from Steven Steen, and he's a fan of you, Brenton. He says, I'm only here for Brenton's intro.
That's great. I love writing these intros for everybody.
He should have left.
Next one is from Rodney Falberg. He says, capitalism needs reform but shouldn't be abandoned for socialism. A temporary tax free UBI, 1,000 a month, for 8 years would give the working class an economic breath and shorten the gap between the 1%.
Okay. Is that for just anyone to comment on?
Yeah.
I mean, so, like, I don't support that, but, basic income is a lot better than most of the other things that people talk about. It's a lot better than what we're doing now, right? And it's better than going all the way to socialism, right? So sort of like just let the market go because it's efficient, let it produce and distribute goods, and then you could redistribute things. Now, I'm not in favor of that, but I think that that's the smart thing. If you kind of like are not that strong on property rights or something, then that's the smart way to do it.
I think what would be really, really interesting if we're going to try to preserve the system of capitalism, and I don't think we necessarily should, largely because of climate change, but if we were to preserve it, and I'm just being overly cynical about everything, I think if you did UBI and combined it with universal health care, you would see an explosion within, especially in the United States, within the flyover states, because there would be people exiting the cities where they're currently forced to live so that they can have a decent job and have health care, and they'd be moving to smaller towns where they could live on the UBI. You'd even see a smaller carbon footprint, I would assume, because there'd be less commuting, less people stuck and taking public transit, and I would really love to see like the renaissance that might come out of that, with that economy being breathed into the smaller towns within the country. I think it would be a wonderful thing.
Except
I just want to say
on the UBI, they aren't producing anything, right? So you've just wiped out a large part of the stream of goods and services that people want.
I mean, it's not to say that they're not producing
created
anything.
About a little over $1 trillion cost for the UBI at the scale he was giving it. About 1.6, about
he said 1,000 a month.
Yeah. What?
The questioner said $1,000 a month.
Yeah, that's $12,000.
This to me is one of the terrifying things about capitalism, which is that we value people's lives based on what they produce, and then we live in a context now where automation is going to get stronger and stronger with AI. So now we have the Sobot, for instance, which is going to automate textiles, and that's now a problem. Eliminating a dirty, dangerous job that nobody really wants is a problem for our society, because now all these people who worked in textiles are going to be jobless for a period of time.
Capitalism is doing that for the last 200 years. Right? If you go back,
but we could build a system
100 years ago, a majority of the population of the U.S. were farmers. That was a dirty, hard job, and we're now down to 2% of the population or something. But I
will say I'm a big Wendell Berry fan, and I think I might prefer that dirty, hard job to a lot of the prospects that we have today under capitalism. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring up during the debate, is that, like, take for instance Cambodia before Pol Pot, before the guy who was almost worse than Pol Pot who preceded him. That was a nation of peaceful Theravada Buddhists, and Westerners came in and they worked 6 months out of the year and had 6 months out of the year off. And Westerners introduced new agricultural methods that allowed them to double their harvest, thinking that they would then continue to create and produce. These Theravada Buddhists then worked 4 months out of the year and kept where they were with the new things. And I think there's really something to be said for that lifestyle, for being satisfied with what you produce, and without the overproduction that is incentivized by capitalism that's currently
killing us. The lifestyle where you're living on the UBI is a lifestyle where other people are doing the work to produce what you consume, and you are not.
Robots are doing it. Like we don't have like the right now we've been having
increased mechanization now for 200 years,
mm-hmm.
and oddly enough, it has not resulted in there being no jobs for humans. It just means that we get richer and richer.
Yeah, because then they have to invent bullshit jobs. Like, but the point being is that like. Right now with COVID, we've got the country mostly shut down, or we tried our best to shut it down and then didn't really shut it down. But there are no supply shortages that we're having as a result of COVID. We're not having a difficulty getting the things that we need. The big problem with COVID is that people are being forced to go to work at Taco Bell and at KFC, and when they do that, they get COVID and they die. Like what are the deaths up to now? Like 200,000 almost.
People who are below about 40 or maybe even 50 who get COVID have something like 1 chance in 1,000 of dying.
Of
People
dying,
like
yes,
me are
but also
experienced
there's permanent. There's like permanent damage. A buddy
We
of
don't
mine
know
is
that
my
yet.
age who got COVID.
There's-
Like
There
he
is
can't even run
damage
up a
which may
hill.
or may not turn out to be permanent. We don't know. We
All
haven't
right.
had anything like that.
Let's move on to the next
my
one.
Let's take another question. Absolutely.
All right, perfect. Actually, the next one is for you, Dr. Friedman. He says, "Are you familiar with Branko-Milanovic's elephant curve? If so, what is your opinion?" And this is from Luis Romero.
I am sorry, I am not familiar with the elephant curve, and I don't know what it is.
Okay.
The world is full of things I don't know, which makes life interesting.
It's true. Con the Stoner Lynn says, "It seems to me that an actual free market prices would tend toward cost as profit from scarcity would be used to create an abundance." Opinions?
I'm not sure I understand the statement. I would have said that by the standards of most past societies, we have an abundance. It's just that we keep raising our standards as we get richer and richer. That much earlier, one of my two opponents, or whatever we're calling each other, was talking about how terrible things were in 19th century England. But that's comparing 19th century England to 21st century England, not comparing 19th century England to 18th or 17th century England.
Well, I invite you to go to rural South Carolina, where there are communities, black and white communities, that don't have running water. We have the corridor of shame, where the schools are literally crumbling. They don't have any infrastructure being built. The roads in South Carolina are horrible. So I would push back against this idea that everyone has better living standards today. There are a lot of people in the USA, the most wealthiest country in the world, who live in conditions that are worse than anything I've seen here in Southeast Asia, and that includes Cambodia.
I mean, the millennial generation, we're living in worse conditions than our parents did. Like, I think across the board.
Especially since COVID.
Hard to believe.
I don't think
1 in 7 Americans are relying on a food pantry. We are ranked 102 in deaths of malnutrition, where, we have it worse than Turkey and a lot of other countries. Worse than Vietnam and Cuba, by the way. I'm not even a Marxist-Leninist, but I will say that the USA has 2 times more deaths by malnutrition than Cuba, and 60 times more deaths by malnutrition than Vietnam.
How do you believe these numbers were calculated for Cuba and for the U.S.? Do you happen to know?
I've got my resource here. It was from the World Bank, I believe. Let me check.
And where did they get the numbers from? They didn't go there themselves.
I live in Vietnam, so I can tell you that the food stabilization program in Vietnam and the food distribution system here in Vietnam is extremely efficient. It works really well. The people love it, and it's been really, really showing it's earning the gold stars here during COVID. There are not people who are suffering from insecurity here the way that they are in the USA. I know that for a fact because I used to volunteer for food banks. I'm still in contact with a lot of those people. The food banks are really suffering right now. That's why I just did a big fundraiser stream with one of my associates for the food banks, because they're suffering right now. And none of those things are happening in Vietnam. There is so much plenty that there is a rice bank right now, a rice ATM that gives out free rice, and there's not enough demand for it. So the guy's having to go out and advertise and get a loudspeaker and say, "Hey, come get free rice," and nobody's coming to get it because everyone has food here in Vietnam. Now that Vietnam is very complicated, so I'm sure people in the comments are right now saying that I'm defending Stalinism or whatever. I invite you to learn more about Vietnam. It's a very complicated situation. Certainly there are aspects of the state that are incredibly abusive here. But if you want to learn more about that, my partner Luna has a channel at youtube.com/LunaOy and gives real first-person, irrefutable evidence of the things that I'm talking about. So.
What I might jump on with that also is like the looming eviction crisis. Even before COVID, the United States had 1.5 million empty homes. That's from the Center for Housing and Urban Development, and only 568,000 homeless people. So we could give each of those homeless people 3 or 4 homes to themselves, and we'd still have homes left over. And
they did it in London.
Yeah.
In London, they gave at the beginning of COVID anyway, they gave every homeless person a room, and it was fine. There was plenty of capacity for it. And they did it, but now of course they're back on the streets.
I mean, I think we could do that once, but in the future, we would have to stop doing it because people would stop building homes when they learned that if it was vacant, then the government would take it away and give it to a homeless person.
I mean, under capitalism, sure, but there are ways to make that happen where you can keep the incentives in place. I mean, people tend to, and this was the other thing, like, because Dr. Friedman, he seemed to have the idea that if we weren't forcing people to engage in the market with the cudgel of poverty, and people went and lived on the UBI, that they wouldn't be contributing to society. I think they absolutely would be contributing. They just would be contributing in a different way than they currently are. I've found I've gone through long periods of unemployment, and I find it is one of the most depressing things that you can do, even when you have a job that is guaranteed to come back. Like, even when all the bills are paid and you are just waiting on your job to come back, like I was when I was managing 2 months out of the year, it was incredibly depressing to go through that period, and I had to find productive ways to busy myself constantly. I think a lot of people are like that. I mean, Khalil Gibran, read On Work by Khalil Gibran. I just put it out on my channel. And I think that in a lot of ways, humans are naturally motivated to work and to contribute to our communities and our families.
There's a great article called Ayn Rand versus Anthropology that talks about what we would call primitive, I hate this terminology, but primitive societies, like pre-agricultural societies. And the fact of the matter is, they are very collectivist in nature, and they have social dynamics where if somebody's not contributing, they go in and they find out why, they take care of that person's whatever issues they're having that cause them to not contribute, and it works really well. It's called Ayn Rand versus Anthropology. There are a lot of case studies in that. But people generally want to contribute, and anybody who says that somebody who gets on welfare is just going to be lazy and do nothing has never had to rely on other people for something before. I've never been on welfare myself, but I've been at periods in my life where I had to rely on other people. I was virtually homeless for one period of time, where I had to have one of my friends who owned several houses let me live in one of their houses for free for a couple of months. I was very fortunate that I had that social contact. If I didn't have that safety network that I had cultivated on my own as an individual, I would have been homeless. And I was not happy with that situation, living in that free house. I wasn't trying to engineer it to live in that house as long as I could. I wanted to get into a stable place.
I don't think you can generalize from yourself to people in general.
No, you can't. But I think that you can look at, there's data points, and we've pointed to.
So I'm not saying that everyone is like this, but there are some people who would just like to live off the work of others if they can and not contribute.
But if we can, okay, so let's say that there are people like that now. What happens to those people? Yeah. Would you say that those people should just die if they
should get
if they're not able to work? But what if they don't? Then they should just die?
I don't know. I mean, so if they refuse to get a job, well, that might be like the unemployed and homeless people that we have right now, right?
It's like, okay. So a great example of that is Columbia, South Carolina, where they just shut down a mental health institution and put them all on the streets, which is why to this day there's a massive homelessness problem in South Carolina. So these are people who cannot get a job, and underlying with a lot of the people who we would call lazy or whatever, there usually are these kinds of underlying extenuating circumstances that I think it's incumbent on us as a society to take care of those people in this situation. That's another thing.
We were discussing a situation where there was a UBI such that people could go to a low-cost place and live off the UBI. That was what Michael and I were responding to.
So like billions of units of clothing in a context where we have the capacity to generate billions of units of clothing and that end up in landfills before they ever come to any consumer. Why should anybody be without clothes? One person can make enough clothing for hundreds or thousands of other people to be clothed. In that context, do you really think we're going to have a situation where we're going to have a catastrophic shortage whenever we can build enough houses for us to have 6 empty houses for every homeless person, hundreds or thousands of units of clothing for every person who needs a pair of clothes? We can generate so much food that we're throwing away tons of it. In that context, 40%. Do you really think that a few lazy people are going to completely dismantle and destroy society?
I don't think so. Lazy people. You're talking about everybody in the U.S. having the option of taking everything as leisure by living at a relatively low income, rather than taking part of their time to produce things. And
well, that's one option. You're making a false dichotomy. There's also the option of making. Of using a contract instrument to create a society where you collectively own the means of whatever your work is with your fellow workers, and you've signed a contract with your community that says, I promise to contribute this amount of labor and do this and this and this, and in exchange I get my material needs met. And if that contract is violated,
doing that today. What it prevents you from doing is making somebody who hasn't signed the contract support you.
I don't have the option to create a collective with other people where I own the infrastructure of my town. There's no way. I couldn't own the internet. How would that pragmatically happen with the system that we have right now? How could I and a few like-minded individuals meaningfully take ownership of our own community, short of ending the state and capitalism?
I don't know what ownership of the community means. But you could take ownership of your own production. We've just been told that you've started firms.
Poverty. Well, I was lucky that I had a student loan to start that. Not everybody has these options that I have, like staying in my friend's house or getting these student loans to start my first company.
You can start a commune right now, right? It's not illegal. Some people have done it.
Right, but communes, that's the weirdest thing, is that everybody thinks communists want to live in communes. The common communism comes from common property. There is a political thing called communalism that is based around living in communes. But I've stayed with communes before. I didn't enjoy it particularly, but I stayed with the 12 tribes while I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia, and they fed me very well and were very nice. But that's not necessarily how I want to live. The thing is especially with the anarchist communists, a lot of us are like aggressive individualists and specifically look at communism, as in common property, as the best system for preserving individual liberty, which was the thing I would have liked to have gone in. Do we need to move to the next question, though? This is fascinating, but I have a feeling we'll be at this all night. I want to be respectful to Dr. Friedman's time.
Yes, we do. Thank you. The next question is from Xanos Carthage for Dr. Friedman. Have you heard about what about youism?
What about what?
What about youism? Like you as in a person, and then ISM. Sounds like you were trying to say that with accusing your opponents that they do not donate their money. So
I don't know what youism is, but
I guess it's a form of whataboutism, but it's like what about youism, I guess.
The argument that I was offering was that if it is the case that failing to help someone is morally equivalent to hurting him, which it seemed to me was implicit in the arguments that my opponents were making, then it would follow that they and pretty much everybody else were murderers. And I don't find that a morally convincing claim. That I think it's important to distinguish between harming someone and failing to help someone. And that if you really take seriously a different argument, if you really take seriously the idea that failing to help somebody is coercion, you then end up with slavery, because you then say, all right, I need your services in order to do surgery on my wife or whatever. If you aren't willing to do them on some terms acceptable to both of us, then you'll have to do it. And that's not an attractive outcome.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would say there's a totalizing way of looking at this, because it is not equivalent to failing to help someone is not equivalent to hurting them, but that doesn't mean failing to help someone is not coercive, especially if you're in a position where if you fail to help that, like where you have demanded an unreasonable reward for failing to help them.
I don't know what makes it unreasonable. I offer somebody a job. He accepts the job, not because it's exactly what he wants, but because it's better than any other job he has available. So I have made him better off, not worse off.
Yeah, say we're in the desert.
Your view is that I'm coercing him because the job is not in all respects what he would like.
Okay,
say we're in the desert. Really quickly, say we're in the desert, and there is a water source, and I need that water or I'm going to die. And you come up to me and you say, no, I own this water source. The only way I will give you a drink is if you agree to become my slave for the rest of your life.
Which is how land ownership began. It has to.
All right. Well, Dr. Friedman's going to get the last word on this, since this was before him.
Yeah, it was a question
and then
for
we'll
him.
go on to the next one.
Is there one more question or not?
You can go. No. You can respond to Brenton, and then we'll move on.
Oh, all right. That is, the water in the desert is a rather unusual situation, and you then would have to ask how the person did or didn't get the ownership of that water. If it's water that he trucked in, then it seems to me that he does have a claim to say, I'm saving your life and I'm going to charge you a very high price for that. He'd be a nicer person if he didn't. If it's water that's just there and he seized it, then he doesn't have that claim. But it seems to me that in general, you are confusing the fact that given what the world is like, somebody has to do things, and otherwise we all starve to death. And you're trying to evade that by imagining a future where somehow technological improvement makes the world so rich that nobody has to do anything. That's not very likely. And the evidence of the last 150 years, during which time real incomes have gone up by something, I think, over an order of magnitude, is that as that happens, people also expand how much they want. And the result is
the myth of I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to talk.
Yeah, let him finish. Let's go on to the next one.
I got excited.
Literally, I could do this for like 8 hours.
This is fun, and we should do it again, whether or not other people are watching.
We absolutely
agreed.
A few more questions here. Just to wrap up, Brian F. says, is it possible to start a socialist movement in a capitalism state and in reverse from a socialism state and allow capitalism in it?
It depends on the form of socialism.
Yeah.
If the socialism is state socialism, then when, as Michael pointed out earlier, when you try to start your capitalist enterprise, the state will probably shut you down. If the socialism is the kind of socialism which involves voluntary cooperation with people, I haven't heard from the other two whether if I do work and produce some capital goods, you're entitled to seize them, and if not, then Michael's point earlier, in that kind of socialist system, people can form capitalism. In a capitalist system, similarly, you can move to state socialism, as has happened in some cases, but in terms of your kind of socialism, as I keep pointing out, if it's really that much better, you don't have to have a revolution. It's something you can do on a small scale. People can create workers' co-ops. Each workers' co-op that supposedly is going to be more productive than a firm was, then it's going to have money with which you can lend to other workers to start another workers' co-op. So if it's really the case your system works, then you don't need a revolution to do it in a capitalist system. And what's much more likely, if it's the case that your system works for some particular niches for a variety of reasons, you might consider, for example, that essentially all law firms in the US are workers' co-ops, so they're workers' co-ops and only some of the workers, namely the partners, running them. But if there are places where it works better, then in a capitalist system, if the government leaves you alone, in those places you will end up with what you're calling socialism.
I mean, what I would say to that is, like, as far as revolution goes, I would hope that a revolution, like a violent revolution, can be avoided. It's never been, in human history, those who gain great power almost never give it up voluntarily. And so I think if there were any kind of a revolution, we would see it as a result of the natural conditions that led to it. I mean, I in a lot of ways, I don't see a revolution as something that everybody just gets together and says, let's have a revolution, let's go do it. You know, you get the population forced into a very specific frame of mind by the material conditions, and lightning hits the right spot, and bang, we've got the French Revolution or the American Revolution.
The revolution is happening right now. I'd like to point out, I have a video where I talk about how to overthrow capitalism, and it's not through getting your AK-47 and going out in the streets, but it's through building dual power structures, mutual aid systems, and there are people who are already doing that and risking their lives engaging in direct action, but more importantly, aiding each other. And you know, we've seen the mutual aid become a common buzzword in our communities now since COVID-19 started up, because basically what rich people are doing is saying, you all need to help yourselves, and we're doing it, and we're building unions, and we're having militant unionism with striking. It is happening right now, and I agree with Brenton that we don't need to have a violent revolution to overthrow capitalism and dismantle it. So to answer Dr. Friedman's question, I do think that we can go ahead and build our anarchistic systems within our communities, but there are major barriers within this current form of state capitalism, and I think even both Dr. Friedman and Dr. Heumer would agree that state capitalism creates a lot of barriers to a lot of people to do things that they should have the liberty to do. And you know, whether it's poverty or whether it's you know, the corporate power and the corporate collusion with the government and that sort of thing. And so, you know, we do need to have this in mind as we're building these systems and be cognizant of that. But I do think that we could start building it right away. Yes.
I would say what's important to look at here when we talk about big economic systems, because usually what happens when somebody says something like what the question was, where they say like, oh, you know, I have the freedom to act like a socialist in a capitalist economy. Do I have the freedom to act like a capitalist in a socialist economy? That's kind of like saying, do I have the freedom to act like an absolute monarchist in a capitalist economy? When society has moved on from one major economic system to another, another major economic system where people are doing things in a completely different way, you may be able to get together with your friends on the weekend and like do something like SCA, which is super cool. And I'm 1000% behind that. But that's not really the same thing as turning the clock back on the economic system and going to an older one. Like, even if you all agree to do it like as some part of like almost full time as some part of a cult.
In your system, if I get money in whatever way is legitimate in your system, and I save it, and I use it to buy to make or buy capital goods, and I then say, all right, these goods require 10 people to work on them, and I'm willing to offer a salary to people to work for this, and I will then, if there isn't enough of a market, I will then trade my output for either other people doing that or with workers' co-ops. I don't mind trading with anybody. Am I allowed to do that, or does somebody have the right to seize my capital goods?
Well, I would say,
Go ahead, Brenton.
okay, so you need to look again at the history of the Spanish anarchists, because what you are describing literally happened in Spain during the revolution, where people who wanted to maintain their own private farms were allowed to do so. But what was very important about that situation was the people that worked for them were working for them voluntarily because they had the chance to take a better deal from the collectivized farms.
I expect it was not a better deal, or you wouldn't have been working for them.
I mean, it was a better deal, but some people stayed because of loyalty or...
How do you know?
Say what?
How do you know? You're making factual assertions, and I don't think they're assertions you could know.
I mean, again, there are a number of books that you can look into on this. Now, we did talk earlier about, like, how do I know that the history that I'm reading is correct? And, history is an abstract. We can use that argument to dismiss any history, and literally, because all of history is just a story that we tell each other. But it seems to me from both the primary and the secondary sources I've read, from reading Orwell, from reading Abel Paz, from reading Adam Hochschild, that this system, in fact, did exist in somewhat of the way that they described. Now, I'm sure there are some differences.
Can I comment?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I think that the original question was something like, can you start up capitalism within a socialist society and vice versa? And okay, if you're in a state socialist society, then no. But the way that I understand anarchism, you could do whatever you want. And like the way I understand anarcho-socialism is, you can start up worker cooperatives. And if the society is anarchist, there's no one to stop you. So of course you can do that. Now, when I say I'm an anarcho-capitalist, I don't mean that I want to stop people from doing that. It's totally fine with me. Right, so some of the firms could be capitalist run and some of them could be worker run, and that's totally fine with me. But I take it that that's not fine with the socialists. They want them all to be worker run, right?
Well, here's what I would say.
This is, I think, is a problem with the theory, because I think there's just no way realistically for that to come about if you don't have a central authority.
EJ, you want to take that?
Well, I was just going to say there is a branch of anarchism called mutualism, which is market. Like markets are not automatically not allowed in any form of anarcho-socialism. Like mutualism is based on markets, and you can have an the whole idea of mutualism is everybody should own their own labor, and so that means if you choose to have a cooperative with other people and build a big factory together, you can do that. If you want to be an individual or have a little family business or whatever, you can do that, as long as you're not coercing somebody else for stealing their labor value. Then that's all fair game. And I would much rather live in a mutualist system than a capitalist system, for sure.
But in a capitalist system, everyone owns his own labor. You only work for somebody to do it.
I certainly didn't own my own labor when I worked for Uber.
It. What?
If Uber owned my property when I worked for Uber, there was no they owned my labor. And
so if you decided to quit, they would have locked you into the car?
No, but I didn't own my own labor, and the
you
fact
own your own labor and you sold it to them. When you own things,
I was out of money. I was broke. I was in a situation where I had to choose an employer.
You had a situation where the best deal you could get was to sell your labor to them. But the fact that you were selling them means that you owned it.
You can use that same argument to justify slavery.
You could, yeah.
Okay.
Or indentured servitude.
Next question, guys.
Are you pro-indentured? Okay.
The next question is from Rodney Falberg. Centrism is not supporting corruption/status quo. It's about having a healthy middle ground and being willing to compromise, not being a hardliner.
We're not willing to compromise on things. I don't think anybody on this panel is willing to compromise on things like human suffering or authoritarianism and that sort of thing. And those are the kinds of things that we're asked to compromise on within, for instance, the United States of America's government where I'm from. We're being asked, like, the compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats is over how much oppression there's going to be. And we're saying there's no oppression is allowed at all. I like to think that all four of us would agree on that, but I think I've talked enough.
Yeah, I guess I'll comment on centrism. I mean, I'm an extremist. I try to be a reasonable extremist, but still an extremist. But it's,
oh, yeah.
I mean, in a way, I'm glad that there are centrists or moderates, not because I think they have the right position, but because, you know, most of the extreme positions are horrible, right? Like, I'm not in favor of extremism in general. There's only this one extreme position I'm in favor of, and if you're not going to go with that, then be a moderate. That's fine, right? That's better.
And also, it depends on context. Like, so I don't think that, like, if we lived in a society that was anarcho-capitalist, they wouldn't call you an extremist. You know, it depends on it all depends on, like, the Overton window that you occupy.
But I mean,
I was a teenager in the 90s. Being extreme is super cool. So,
but I mean, I think, like, there's a, you know, if you don't. If you're not super into all of this and, like, you haven't read the books on anarcho-capitalism and everything, I think it's totally reasonable for your initial reaction to be, I want to stay away from these crazies. And that's reasonable partly because, like, you know, the society that we're living in is going really well by historical standards, by human standards. Like, you know, nobody tried to murder me that I can remember ever. It's just like just from that alone, right? And so when you start to think, you know, somebody's planning on radically changing society, if you don't know a whole lot about it, it's totally reasonable to think no, right? That's probably going to be bad.
Gotcha. Next question is from Andy McKay. He says, do you assume markets in a stateless society would be as hierarchically structured as they are today without all the state privileges to capital holders? I imagine them to be far from more horizontal.
I think that there would be some hierarchy. If you think about corporations, there is a real trade-off between, as I was saying before, between market and hierarchy as well as organizing things. And the classic work on this is an article by Ronald Coase called Theory of the Firm, where he's trying to ask, why do firms sometimes produce things in-house and sometimes buy them from other people? So it may well be that you would have fewer large firms or not as large firms without the government. So it's very hard to figure out the real effect of governments because they interfere in so many different ways. But I think that even in a perfectly free capitalist society, there would be some substantial firms because there are some activities where it turns out that the advantage of doing something in-house is larger than the advantage of doing out-house. On the other hand, I rather enjoy an agoric system, one in which everybody is, as it were, independent. And at the moment, the only thing I am doing that earns me money is writing books and self-publishing.
Which is awesome. That's the dream.
Now audiobooks as well.
So I think that in a really laissez-faire capitalist society, the average firm size would be smaller than it is in ours, because I think the government is doing things that sort of favor larger firms, right? One of the things is when you get big enough, you can kind of lobby the government. The bigger your firm is, the more kind of political influence you can have. The other thing is people maybe don't realize this, that regulation favors larger firms over smaller ones, because basically compliance is a large fixed cost. If you're starting up your own business, just like with you and a few people, you probably can't afford to hire all the lawyers to figure out all the regulations, right? Besides that, the regulations are their content is probably designed to make it harder for small firms. So that's part of what's going wrong in our society.
Yeah, Michael, by the way, you're 1000% right on that, and I 100% agree. But the thing that I wanted to bring up in response to the question, not your wonderful comment, was, and this actually does tie into something you said earlier, because it sounded like you were making kind of the opposite argument that David Graeber made in his Parable of the Divided Island. By the way, I'm very second of silence for David Graeber. It was awful that we lost him because he's brilliant. But you know, the idea is that if you did move beyond liberal capitalism as we see it today, or what ANCAPs might call corporatism or something, where the government subsidizes various businesses and backs up property claims with its police and military. The idea is that if you really did that, you took two groups of like one ANCAPs who want to organize hierarchically and one ANCOMs who want to organize in a more egalitarian way, between both of them, you would very quickly see both societies affected by the removal of state power. And it would come to resemble, the system that came out would come to resemble something entirely different than what we are used to thinking of capitalism as. So I would highly recommend everybody read that short essay, The Parable of the Divided Isle.
And I just want to say that I'm a little bit surprised to hear Dr. Huemer say that as these firms get bigger, they get more influence. And I'm a little bit confused, like, how does removing the state change that dynamic? I still think that as they get bigger and wealth is accumulated, they get more political influence. I don't see how that dynamic would change with or without the state. It's just that with the state, you have the state to your method of kind of transforming that power into more power is through the apparatus of the state and manipulation of the state. And without the state, you just do it a little bit more directly, where you hire the Pinkertons yourself and give them the Winchester. You know what I'm saying? So you still have that same dynamic where the larger and more wealth you accumulate, the more political influence you have. So I'm wondering what the state has to do with that basic power.
If you want to respond, Dr. Huemer, after that we can go ahead and move on to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like by political influence, I meant influence on the state. So if there's no state, you don't have that. Now you can like do stuff with your money in whether there's a state or not. You can like get influenced by paying people to do stuff. But if you're thinking, oh, well, maybe you can like start your own state-like enterprise, right? If you're super rich. I mean, part of the point is that it's hard to get super rich without without lobbying the government for favors. Like that's part of why we have a bunch of really large companies. I'm not saying there won't be any large companies, but I'm saying there would be less.
Gotcha.
Okay, but if the story is going to be, oh yeah, so you use your money to hire a bunch of armed guards and start up something that's kind of like the state. Then we have to talk about the competition among security firms and the stuff that anarcho-capitalists usually say about that, right?
Gotcha. Next.
Warlordism predates the state.
All right. Next question is from Sunflower. They say, at NC, do you actually believe Vietnam's stats on death rate from malnutrition? I see it as 0.02, whereas neighborhood Laos and Cambodia are over 400 times that.
Come to Southeast Asia and travel around and you will quickly see why that is. Cambodia and Vietnam are absolutely massively different, and a big reason of that is because of capitalism. If you go to Cambodia, food is very expensive. So for example, if you want to buy rice in Cambodia, it's all 100% dictated by the market. Cambodia is a very poor and imperialized country, and rice and food staples are very expensive there. We recently had a epidemic that was killing pigs, some kind of pork disease. I don't know. I don't remember what it was called or whatever. But this was a big problem that affected the whole region. It affected China, Vietnam, Laos, everything. Vietnam's pork prices stabilized. They were stabilized. The government has a very good price stabilization program. Again, I'm not a statist. I don't think this is the best solution, but within the context of having a state, I think price stabilization works. It has worked in Vietnam very, very well. And if you travel around Vietnam, you will see poverty, but you will not see privation. You will not see starvation. You do not see very many homeless people at all. Whereas if you travel around Cambodia, I haven't been to Laos, so I'm not going to speak to Laos, but if you travel around Cambodia, you'll see homelessness, you'll see privation, you'll see much lower standards of living for most people. Most people in Vietnam, they have a house, they have food every month. They might not make a lot of money, but the standard of living for a person, you got to remember the cost of living in the USA is heavily inflated. So a person living in Vietnam, and again, you can go check out Luna's channel. She goes through all this and breaks this all down. But a person making like around $500, $600, $700 a month in Vietnam has a better standard of living and actually saves more money per year than an American worker working 40 hours a week on minimum wage. So, I mean, it's not an apple and apple situation. It's very apple and oranges. The way that the communities are structured here is totally different. They have better, and this is the part where I didn't really get a chance to get into this, but what I really think is anarchistic about Vietnam is the culture here. It's a very collectivist, anarchistic culture. Vietnamese people do not like following rules. That was a big thing that people said about why Vietnam was so good at handling COVID. Vietnamese people do not like to follow rules. If you don't believe me, go look at pictures or videos of Vietnamese traffic patterns. They do not like traffic laws. They do not follow traffic laws. And no Vietnamese person will follow a rule just because it's the law. There's a very common expression that goes back 1,000 years here, which is that the rule of the village trumps the law of the king. And Vietnamese people take care of each other on a very ground level. And so I've been to Vietnamese ward meetings, which is like a little neighborhood meeting, basically, where they'll be like, okay, there's this homeless man. There's an old man, he's homeless. What are we going to do about it? Okay, Miss Nguyen, you have an empty room in your house. He can live there. I'll bring him food every day. And I saw this happen. They mutual aided each other into solving this problem. And that is why they still have these bonds, these collectivist bonds. And I think that we can move back to that as a society. But this is really getting
a lot of the pigs. I'm a little puzzled. A lot of the pigs died, so there were actually fewer pigs to be eaten in Vietnam as well as in Cambodia.
So the government bought pork from other countries and imported it and kept the price stable. That's what happened.
I see. So the government is importing pork from other countries with tax money, basically.
Yeah, and now again, I'm not a state socialist, so I don't think that's the ideal way to do things. But it did work much better than what was happening at like Cambodia and I believe Laos and China definitely were affected much more by this. Whereas I was here through the whole thing, and there was basically no impact on the market. There was a very brief period where a few people tried to gouge pork prices in the first day or two, but then that stopped as soon as the price stabilization kicked in, which happened very, very quickly. So I mean, I'm not saying that that's the ideal system, but it did work.
Next comment is actually a skeptic toward me. They say, moderator, with all due respect, moderate. These leftists are just dominating the conversation. They're rambling and interrupting most of the time. So I apologize if you don't feel heard. And
I like that I like that he's admitting we won. But I should also say, this was not since Michael was not around, it might seem that we were talking too much.
Oh, yeah, he's just complaining that you guys keep going on and won't let us talk, which you just illustrated.
All right. Well, that is all for the questions. I really appreciate you all coming on. Thank you all so much for your time. I know you guys are very busy, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Was a lot of fun
for being here and watching. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I hope if people are curious about my ideas, go look at my webpage, daviddfriedman.com. That's pretty easy to remember, and you can find Machinery of Freedom and lots and lots of articles on different things. There's a variety of other books that I make available for free because I'm writing books mostly to get people to read them.
Wonderful. If anyone wants to make just like goodbye statements, you can, just like that, nice, short and pithy, and then we can call it a night.
Sure. I would like, again, to take my hat off to Dr. David Friedman. I am so honored that he came in here and talked with us for this time. It's been very, very stimulating, and I'm happy that Michael Huemer was able to come in. Dr. Heumer, I would love to get a chance to talk with you at a longer length. Just if you guys can, please go subscribe to my channel. We are growing very, very quickly. Do a lot of talk about politics, philosophy, and Buddhism.
I thank the people who had this debate. It was fun. It would obviously take another 40 or 50 hours of talk to reach any serious agreement, but they seem to be pleasant people. I still, however, do not see their solution to the problem of the coordination problem. As far as I can tell, it consists of saying there are places where it was solved, but not of explaining it. Sort of as an economist, I want to understand the theory, because I don't think you can never learn history. But I think you have to be very suspicious of historical claims, whereas you have to be suspicious of theoretical claims too, but at least the theoretical claim you can get inside your head and see what the holes are, whereas the historical claim could be completely bogus, could be completely true, and it takes a lot of work to find out. Anyway.
So, I want to apologize for being apparently 2 hours late or something like that. Anyway, I also want to recommend my book, The Problem of Political Authority, where I explain my views about anarcho-capitalism. Also David Friedman has an excellent book called The Machinery of Freedom, which you should read. I want to recommend my blog, which is called fakenous.net. Fake news spelled FAKENOUS.net.
Gotcha. Non-compete, is there any last words? Are there any last words you have?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for being here, for watching. I'm glad that we did this just because it exposed me to the works of Dr. Friedman and Dr. Huemer. And even though it might not seem this way from watching your previous lectures, I do believe we agree in a tremendous amount of things. And you have both given me a lot to think about. And, so I really am glad you've been here. If I did talk over too much, I not to make an excuse, but there is a bit of a delay. I'm here in Vietnam. So there were times when I jumped in because I thought you were finished, and I never intentionally tried to dominate the conversation as an anarchist. I apologize if that was ever the case, but yeah, you can check out my channel.
We were just acting anarchically.
Right, it's chaos. Anarchism is just chaos. No, but youtube.com/noncompete.
Oh, that reminds me,
I was definitely joking. That is not my
an
actual
unfortunate
position.
slam.
Yeah.
Everybody,
Yeah,
I think everyone at this table would really appreciate this. Go to my YouTube channel and Google Anarcho. It's a short play that I wrote about a bunch of anarchists, including an ANCAP, trying to run a pizza shop in post-revolutionary Brooklyn. And it's like Bob's Burgers meets Occupy Wall Street. I think everybody would really enjoy that.
Wonderful.
That sounds great.
Well, in James's words, keep differentiating the reasonable from the unreasonable, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.